The Golden Age of Piracy, spanning from approximately 1650 to 1730, represents a defining era in maritime history. This period witnessed the emergence of thousands of pirates who plundered the shipping lanes of the Atlantic Ocean, Caribbean Sea, and Indian Ocean, disrupting colonial trade and challenging the might of European empires. The causes of this explosive rise in piracy were deeply rooted in geopolitical upheaval, economic competition, and the harsh realities of seafaring life. Following the conclusion of the 30 Years' War in 1648 and the gradual decline of Spanish naval dominance, new colonial powers, England, France, and the Netherlands, began expanding their reach into the Americas. As these empires vied for dominance, they relied heavily on maritime commerce to supply their colonies and transport valuable goods back to Europe. The transatlantic trade route carried gold, silver, sugar, tobacco, spices, and enslaved people, creating lucrative opportunities for those willing to attack merchant vessels. Colonial ports became vital hubs in this sprawling economic network, and it was on these high seas that piracy found fertile ground. Initially, many of the men who became pirates had served as privateers, sailors commissioned by governments to raid enemy ships during wartime. Letters of marque provided legal sanction for such attacks, and privateering proved immensely profitable. However, when hostilities ceased, particularly after the War of the Spanish Succession, 1701-1714, thousands of these armed sailors were left unemployed. With few options and a taste for maritime plunder, many turned to piracy. The distinction between privateering and piracy, always blurry, all but vanished in the early 18th century. One of the earliest and most infamous centers of pirate activity was Tortuga, a small island off the northern coast of Hispaniola. During the mid-1600s, French buccaneers, known as the Brethren of the Coast, established a loose, semi-democratic society that revolved around shared plunder and mutual defense. Tortuga offered a safe haven for pirates to repair ships, trade goods, and plan their next raids. Similar communities soon arose in other parts of the Caribbean, including Port Royal, Jamaica, and later Nassau in the Bahamas. Port Royal in particular gained notoriety as a pirate haven. Captured by the English from Spain in 1655, it became a bustling port that welcomed privateers and outlaws alike. Known for its vice, indulgence, and corruption, it was referred to as the richest and wickedest city in the world. Pirates could easily dispose of their stolen cargo through complicit merchants and officials. However, in 1692, a devastating earthquake destroyed much of the city, sinking large portions into the sea. This disaster marked the decline of Port Royal's influence, though piracy in the region continued to flourish. Life aboard pirate ships was brutal, but often more appealing than the alternatives. Merchant sailors and naval seamen endured strict discipline, meager rations, and poor wages. Pirates, by contrast, operated under a code of conduct that allowed for a degree of democracy and shared wealth. Captains were typically elected by the crew and could be deposed by vote. Plunder was divided according to agreed-upon shares, with extra compensation for those wounded in battle. This level of autonomy and fairness attracted many disillusioned sailors. Pirates developed their own internal codes, known as Articles of Agreement, which outlined rules for behavior, division of loot, and punishments for transgressions. These articles varied by ship but reflected an early form of maritime governance. For example, crew members were often forbidden from fighting on board and were entitled to rest and food in equal measure. Some pirate ships even provided a rudimentary form of insurance. A sailor who lost a limb in combat might receive monetary compensation from the collective earnings. Despite these internal rules, pirate crews were capable of extraordinary violence. They raided coastal settlements, executed captives, and tortured prisoners for information. Some pirates earned reputations for their cruelty, while others relied on fearsome appearances to intimidate their targets into surrender. The iconic image of the Jolly Roger flag, a skull and crossbones on a black background, emerged as a psychological weapon, signaling impending doom. The Caribbean became the epicenter of piracy during this era, but pirate activity was not confined to the region. Pirates roamed the eastern seaboard of North America, attacked ships off the coast of West Africa, and even ventured into the Indian Ocean. Madagascar and the island of Saint Mary's became temporary homes for pirate fleets, particularly those preying on Mughal and East India Company vessels. These global operations reflect the extensive reach and adaptability of pirate enterprises. Piracy thrived in part because of complicity and corruption. Some colonial governors turned a blind eye to pirate activity or actively profited from it. In times of peace, pirates injected wealth into struggling colonial economies by spending their loot on supplies, drink, and repairs. Local merchants, innkeepers, and officials often welcomed their business, making it difficult for imperial authorities to crack down on piracy without local support. One of the most prominent figures of the early Golden Age was Henry Morgan. Born in Wales around 1635, Morgan arrived in the Caribbean as a soldier and quickly rose to fame as a privateer. Sponsored by the English crown, he led successful attacks on Spanish ports, including Portobello and Panama. His raids were marked by strategic brilliance and ruthless efficiency. Though he was briefly imprisoned in England for violating a treaty, he was later knighted and returned to Jamaica as its lieutenant governor. Morgan's story illustrates the fine line between piracy and state-sanctioned violence. By the early 18th century, the problem of piracy had grown so severe that European powers began to take coordinated action. Naval patrols were increased, pirate bases were attacked, and captured pirates were publicly executed as a warning to others. The British government, in particular, launched an aggressive campaign to suppress piracy, culminating in the appointment of Woodes Rogers as governor of the Bahamas in 1718. Rogers offered pardons to pirates who surrendered and hunted those who resisted. The introduction of the King's Pardon in 1717 marked a turning point. Many pirates accepted clemency in exchange for giving up their criminal ways. Those who did not, such as Charles Vane, Calico Jack Rackham, and the infamous Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard, were relentlessly pursued and ultimately captured or killed. Blackbeard's death in 1718 at the hands of Royal Navy forces signaled the beginning of the end for large-scale piracy in the Atlantic. While piracy would never be fully eradicated, the Golden Age gradually faded. Stronger navies, increased colonial oversight, and the development of more secure trading routes made piracy less viable. Nevertheless, the era left a lasting legacy in maritime history and popular culture. The exploits of pirates, their symbols, and their defiance of authority continue to captivate imaginations to this day. In the chapters that follow, we will explore the lives and legends of the most infamous pirates, the structure of their ships, and the economic and cultural forces that shaped their world. This is the story of an age when outlaws ruled the waves and empires trembled at the sight of a black flag. While the crackdown on piracy in the Atlantic was intensifying, piracy remained a persistent threat in the Indian Ocean. Pirates such as Henry Every and Thomas Tew capitalized on the lucrative trade routes between India, Arabia, and Africa. Every's 1695 capture of the Mughal ship Ganges Sawai, laden with immense wealth, became legendary. The attack provoked diplomatic outrage, nearly jeopardizing English trade with the Mughal Empire. Though Every vanished, likely with his treasure, his legend endures. In the Western Atlantic, pirate activity also touched the North American colonies. The coasts of the Carolinas and Virginia became hunting grounds for pirates who preyed on merchant vessels or sought refuge among sympathetic colonists. Some, like Blackbeard, forged alliances with local officials and used remote inlets as secure bases. His blockade of Charleston in 1718 demonstrated both his audacity and the inability of colonial governments to defend their ports without support from the Royal Navy. Pirates were more than criminals. They were also seafaring experts. They knew how to read tides, currents, and winds, and many had extensive naval or merchant experience. Their ability to navigate treacherous waters, maintain ships, and conduct coordinated attacks made them formidable opponents. Pirates often modified their ships for speed and maneuverability, sacrificing cargo space for additional cannons or crew quarters. This tactical edge allowed them to outrun pursuers and strike with precision. The era's end did not erase its influence. Pirate myths endured long after their suppression, embedded in the folklore of seafaring nations. Tales of buried treasure, secret maps, and ghost ships fed the imaginations of generations. Though embellished in popular culture, these stories often contain grains of truth about the brutal, daring lives led by real pirates. Part 2 will explore the most infamous pirates in detail, their origins, their ships, and their defining raids, as we journey deeper into the heart of the Golden Age. Though piracy as a large-scale threat faded, its cultural legacy persisted. In literature, art, and modern media, pirates became symbols of adventure, rebellion, and freedom. Among the many figures who came to define the Golden Age of piracy, few have left as lasting an impression as Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard. Active primarily between 1716 and 1718, Blackbeard was not the most successful pirate in terms of captured wealth, but his theatrical style and psychological tactics made him one of the most feared men on the sea. Born around 1680, possibly in Bristol, England, Teach served as a privateer during the War of the Spanish Succession, before turning to Pirac. In late 1717, Blackbeard captured a large French slave ship, La Concorde, near the Caribbean island of Martinique. He renamed the vessel Queen Anne's Revenge and outfitted it with 40 guns, making it one of the most heavily armed pirate ships of its time. With this formidable vessel, Blackbeard blockaded the port of Charleston, South Carolina in May 1718, holding the town hostage until medical supplies were delivered. Despite the violent potential of this act, no blood was shed, highlighting his bravura. After running the Queen Anne's Revenge aground near Beaufort, North Carolina, Blackbeard accepted a royal pardon from Governor Charles Eden, who may have been complicit in Blackbeard's continued piracy under the guise of legitimacy. This arrangement did not last long. In November 1718, Virginia Governor Alexander Spotswood, frustrated with Blackbeard's activities, dispatched 2 Royal Navy sloops under Lieutenant Robert Maynard. The confrontation occurred at Ocracoke Inlet, though Blackbeard fought fury. Another infamous pirate of the period was William Kidd, whose career remains one of the most controversial in piracy's history. Kidd was born in Scotland around 1655 and became a respected privateer for the English crown. In 1696, he received a commission to hunt pirates and French vessels in the Indian Ocean. However, his voyage proved a financial disaster, and his crew grew restless. In 1698, Kidd captured the Armenian merchant ship Quedar Merchant, which he believed was a legal prize due to its friend. Kidd's case was politically charged. When he returned to the American colonies, colonial authorities turned him over to England, where he stood trial in 1701. The proceedings were heavily biased, and Kidd was found guilty of piracy and murder. He was hanged in London, and his body was left suspended in chains along the River Thames as a warning to others. His story became a symbol of the blurred lines between privateering and piracy, and rumors of his hidden treasure have fueled speculation for centuries. The Golden Age also featured female pirates who defied the rigid gender norms of their time. Anne Bonny, born in Ireland around 1697, moved to the Carolinas as a child and eventually eloped with a small-time pirate. Dissatisfied with a domestic life, she joined the crew of Calico Jack Rackham, disguising herself as a man to participate in raids. On board, she met Mary Red, another woman dressed as a man who had served in both the British and Dutch military. The two formed a fearsome partnership. Bonny and Reed operated in the Caribbean during the early 1720s, attacking ships and evading capture for several years. Their exploits were cut short in 1720, when a pirate hunter captured Rackham's crew off the coast of Jamaica. Most of the men were sentenced to hang. Bonny and Reed both claimed to be pregnant, which delayed their executions. Mary Red died in prison, likely from illness. Anne Bonny's fate remains uncertain, with some accounts suggesting she was released and lived under a new identity. Calico Jack Rackham, though less effective as a pirate, gained notoriety largely due to his flamboyant clothing and the fame of his female crewmates. He operated mostly in the Bahamas and along the Jamaican coast, capturing small fishing boats and coastal traders. His career was short-lived, but his adoption of the now iconic skull and crossbones flag cemented his legacy in pirate lore. Charles Vane, in contrast, epitomized the violent and rebellious spirit that characterized the latter part of the Golden Age. Vane refused royal pardons and maintained a defiant stance against colonial authority. He was known for his cruelty and refusal to back down, often engaging in fights with other pirates and colonial forces alike. After being marooned by his crew, Vane attempted to survive on a remote island before being captured. He was tried and executed in 1721, a symbol of piracy's decline. Benjamin Hornigold represented another transitional figure. Initially a pirate operating out of Nassau, he was known for mentoring a young Blackbeard. However, by 1718, Hornigold accepted a royal pardon and began hunting his former comrades. His career shift from pirate to pirate hunter illustrates the changing tides of the era and the effectiveness of Britain's strategy to divide and dismantle the pirate community. Stade de Bonnet, often referred to as the gentleman pirate, provides one of the most peculiar stories. Born into a wealthy Barbadian family, Bonnet inexplicably abandoned his estate and purchased a ship in 1717 to become a pirate, despite having no naval experience. His early ventures were disastrous, and he eventually partnered with Blackbeard. Their uneasy alliance deteriorated, and Bonnet was captured in 1718. Despite multiple escape attempts, he was hanged in Charleston, South Carolina, later that Yai. As these figures rose and fell, the pirate stronghold in Nassau, Bahamas, flourished. It became a republic of outlaws, a self-governed enclave where pirates could refit ships, rest, and trade. The lack of effective colonial control allowed piracy to thrive. However, in 1718, Britain appointed Woodes Rogers as governor, tasked with restoring order. Rogers offered pardons to pirates who surrendered and aggressively pursued those who resisted. His campaign marked the beginning of the end for Nassau's Golden. This chapter of pirate history reveals the diversity within the pirate world. Men and women, rich and poor, brutal and idealistic, who chose lives of danger and rebellion. Their stories, shaped by ambition, desperation, and the ever-shifting politics of empire, provide a deeper understanding of why piracy thrived and how it was eventually subdued. The next chapter will examine how pirate ships functioned as micro-societies at sea, governed by codes, cooperation, and the shared pursuit of fortune. Pirate society was complex and often misunderstood. While their reputations were built on violence and theft, pirates developed communities aboard their ships that challenged traditional hierarchies. Captains were not tyrants, but elected leaders, chosen for their experience, bravery, or charisma. They could be deposed by vote if they failed to perform their duties or lost the confidence of the crew. The quartermaster served as a counterbalance to the captain's power, representing the interests of the sea. Discipline was enforced through agreed-upon rules, often enshrined in written articles signed by the crew. These articles addressed issues ranging from the division of plunder to the prohibition of gambling and fighting aboard ship. In some cases, punishments for breaking the code included marooning, a form of exile in which offenders were left on deserted islands with minimal provisions. While cruel, these practices served to maintain order and loyalty within pirate ranks. One of the most important values among pirates was the fair distribution of loot. Unlike naval or merchant crews, who were often exploited and underpaid, pirate crews received shares based on a pre-agreed formula. The captain and quartermaster received larger portions, but ordinary sailors were compensated far more generously than their legal counterparts. This egalitarian system attracted many disillusioned seamen who had experienced harsh treatment under legitimate flags. Pirate crews were also surprisingly diverse. Ships included men of various nationalities and ethnic backgrounds, including escaped enslaved Africans, indigenous peoples, and political exiles. This diversity was not always born of idealism, but necessity. Pirates valued skill, loyalty, and strength above race or origin. For many, life aboard a pirate ship offered more opportunity and freedom than the rigid social structures of colonial society. Life at sea, however, was perilous. Pirates faced constant threats from storms, disease, starvation, and combat. Scurvy, dysentery, and other ailments took a heavy toll. Medical care was rudimentary, and injuries from battle or accidents could quickly become fatal. Despite these dangers, many pirates chose this life willingly, driven by a mix of desperation, ambition, and the allure of freedom. In the next chapter, we will explore the technology and structure of pirate ships, their design, armaments, daily routines, and how these vessels enabled pirates to wage war on the empires of the sea. Despite their outlaw status, pirates occasionally cooperated with local communities, especially in remote or poorly governed colonies. Some port towns welcomed pirate ships for the business they brought, selling supplies, repairing vessels, and purchasing stolen goods at discounted rates. In exchange, pirates offered protection or economic stimulation. These relationships were usually informal and often denied by colonial authorities, but they reveal the complicated role piracy played in the Atlantic. Piracy was not simply a disruption to commerce. It became an alternative system that challenged the authority and economics of empire. As pirate ships continued to roam the seas, their influence stretched beyond their numbers. Governments were forced to confront the deeper issues that led thousands to abandon legal seafaring for a life of piracy. Issues of inequality, exploitation, and the relentless pursuit of profit. In the following section, we turn to the heart of piracy's operational success. The ships they sailed, the tactics The pirate ship was more than just a vessel of war or transport. It was a mobile society, a home, a fortress, and a symbol of freedom and defiance. The types of ships pirates used varied widely depending on their region, purpose, and the availability of captured vessels. Unlike naval fleets bound by bureaucratic processes, pirates chose ships that maximized speed, maneuverability, and the ability to evade pursuit. One of the most iconic pirate vessels was the sloop, a small single-masted ship with a Sloops were especially popular in the Caribbean and along the North American coast. Their design allowed for quick navigation through shallow waters, hidden inlets, and narrow passages, terrain where larger naval ships could not follow. Though they typically carried fewer guns than frigates or galleons, their agility made them formidable when crewed by experienced pirates who knew how to strike with precision and vanish into the coastline. The sloop's light draft and square rigging also made it ideal for... Another favoured vessel was the brigantine, a two-masted ship that balanced speed and firepower. Slightly larger than a sloop, the brigantine could support more cannons and a larger crew while maintaining high manoeuvrability. Pirates often captured merchant ships and refitted them for their own purposes, stripping excess weight, reinforcing hulls, and optimizing the vessel for raiding rather than long-haul transport. These modifications reflected the pirates' practical understanding of maritime engineering. Cannons were the primary offensive tools on pirate ships. These were often salvaged from captured vessels or traded through underground markets. A typical pirate ship might carry 6 to 20 guns, depending on size and capacity. Pirates often relied on surprise and intimidation more than brute firepower. A well-aimed broadside or a single warning shot could cause a merchant crew to surrender without resistance. Pirates avoided prolonged battles whenever possible. Damage to their own vessel meant lost. In addition to cannons, pirates used a variety of handheld weapons, including flintlock pistols, cutlasses, boarding axes, and grenades. Pistols were effective at close range but unreliable beyond a few meters, while the cutlass, a short curved sword, was the weapon of choice for boarding. Its design allowed for quick, powerful strikes in the cramped conditions of ship decks. Boarding parties moved swiftly, using noise, fear, and aggression to overwhelm defenders. Smoke, screams, and the chaos of combat. The organization aboard pirate ships was markedly different from that of naval or merchant vessels. Authority was not inherited or assigned by social status. It was earned. The captain was chosen by the crew and retained power only so long as he delivered success and protected the interests of his men. The quartermaster held equal and sometimes greater authority when it came to distributing loot and enforcing discipline. This shared governance provided a check against abuse and fostered loyalty. Daily life at sea was harsh, but in many ways more equitable than on government-run ships. Duties were rotated, and all crew members were expected to contribute to sailing, cooking, repairs, and maintenance. Meals typically consisted of salted meat, hardtack, beans, and whatever fresh provisions could be acquired in port or through raids. Water was stored in barrels and often turned foul on long voyages. Alcohol, particularly rum, was a staple of pirate life, though excessive drinking was discouraged. Music and storytelling were important aspects of pirate culture. Sea shanties helped pass the time and coordinate labour, while tales of past exploits, ghost ships, and buried treasure circulated among the crew. These narratives reinforced a shared identity and helped maintain morale during long, monotonous weeks at sea. Games, gambling, and contests of strength also filled the idle hours. Discipline was strict, but often fair. Pirates who violated the articles faced punishment ranging from flogging to Pirate ships were often adorned with personal touches. Some crews flew unique versions of the Jolly Roger, tailored with symbols to instill fear: skeletons, hourglasses, hearts, or weapons. The flag was more than an emblem, it was a statement of intent. Flying it before an attack offered a chance for surrender, but once raised in battle, it declared that no quarter would be given. These psychological tactics were highly effective, especially against merchant crews who lacked training or incentive to fight. Repairs and resupply were vital to pirate operations. Ships were regularly careened, hauled onto a beach, and scraped of marine growth that slowed movement. This process took days and required safe harbours, often in remote or hidden locations. Pirates also needed to maintain sails, rigging, and hull integrity. Blacksmiths, carpenters, and sailmakers were highly valued members of any crew. Resupply missions were dangerous and often involved bribes, theft, or clandestine deals with unscrupulous merchants, and navigation was both an art and a science. Pirates relied on compasses, astrolabes, sextants, and increasingly on charts and logs stolen from captured ships. Skilled navigators were essential, particularly in unfamiliar waters or during storms. The ability to plot a course quickly and accurately could mean the difference between a successful escape and capture. Some pirates, like Bartholomew Roberts, were noted for their exceptional navigational abilities, allowing them to range far from the Caribbean in. The economy of piracy extended far beyond the decks of ships and the scenes of maritime raids. It was a shadow system of trade and wealth redistribution that influenced colonial markets and unsettled imperial authorities. Pirates did not plunder for chaos alone. They relied on organized channels to sell stolen goods, acquire provisions, and manage their wealth. The success of piracy depended not only on boldness at sea, but on access to a network of ports, traders, and intermediaries willing to deal with. Pirates typically targeted ships carrying valuable commodities: gold, silver, indigo, tobacco, sugar, cocoa, and textiles. These goods, once seized, needed to be unloaded discreetly. Pirates avoided major ports with strong naval presence, preferring smaller, poorly governed harbours where local officials could be bribed or coerced into cooperation. In places like Nassau, Madagascar, and Port-de-Paix, informal pirate economies flourished. These ports served as hubs where goods could be exchanged for weapons. The buyers of pirate loot were not always criminals themselves. In many colonial outposts, legitimate merchants knowingly purchased stolen goods at reduced prices, then resold them at a profit. Some colonial administrators and plantation owners turned a blind eye to these transactions, benefiting from the influx of cheap materials and the spending power of pirate crews. Such tolerance was particularly evident in the Caribbean, where colonial economies were often fragile and heavily reliant on external currency was both fluid and unreliable in pirate society. Official coinage from Spain, France, England, and the Netherlands circulated alongside Spanish pieces of 8, gold doubloons, and silver reals. When formal currency was scarce, barter became common. Pirates traded rum, gunpowder, cloth, and stolen goods for supplies and repairs. The lack of a centralized currency system made it difficult for imperial powers to track pirate wealth or limit their influence. In some cases, pirates buried their tree. Pirates did not hoard all their wealth. When in port, they were notorious spenders. Taverns, gambling houses, and brothels prospered from their visits. A single crew returning from a successful raid might inject more money into a colonial town in a week than regular trade would in a month. This sudden influx of capital created short-term booms in port economies and further cemented the dependence of some communities on pirate commerce. The reputation of pirates as carousers was partly true, but also Madagascar's northeast coast was one of the most notable pirate enclaves outside the Caribbean. During the late 1600s and early 1700s, it became a staging ground for raids on Indian Ocean shipping. Pirates such as Henry Every and Thomas Tew used the island as a base to attack Mughal and East India Company vessels. The island's strategic position and lack of European control allowed pirates to establish temporary settlements where they could resupply and trade with local populations and unscrupulous Euro. The pirate economy was inherently unstable. Wealth gained from a single successful raid could vanish in days through reckless spending, theft, or capture. Many pirates died penniless, despite once possessing fortunes. The lack of formal banks or investment mechanisms meant that storing wealth safely was nearly impossible. Some attempted to bury treasure, giving rise to the enduring myth of hidden pirate hoards. While a few such caches may have existed, most treasure was quickly spent or lost. Not all pirate wealth came from looting ships. Some pirates extorted coastal settlements, demanding tribute in exchange for protection. Others imposed informal tolls on maritime traffic through key channels. These tactics were not unlike those used by state navies or corsairs, blurring the line between piracy and sanctioned warfare. In regions where colonial authority was weak, pirate power often substituted for government, imposing order in their own brutal, self-interested way. As pirate activity grew, it began to affect global trade routes and shipping strategies. Merchant companies altered their paths to avoid known pirate waters, and insurers increased premiums for cargo shipped through high-risk areas. Some merchants hired armed escorts or travelled in convoys. These adaptations added cost and complexity to colonial trade and spurred governments to take stronger action against piracy. Efforts to dismantle the pirate economy intensified in the early 18th century. Naval patrols increased, informants were rewarded, and corrupt officials were removed or punished. The appointment of experienced governors like Woodes Rogers in the Bahamas aimed to replace pirate-dependent commerce with legal enterprise. Rogers closed pirate ports, arrested complicit merchants, and offered pardons to pirates willing to reform. Though these efforts were initially met with resistance, they gradually reduced By the mid-1720s, the pirate economy was in retreat. Former strongholds were dismantled or reclaimed by colonial authorities, and the underground networks that sustained piracy collapsed under pressure. Nonetheless, the legacy of this shadow economy lingered. It had challenged the legitimacy of empire, exposed the vulnerability of transatlantic commerce, and offered an alternative vision of wealth and power rooted not in inheritance or royal charter, but in cunning, courage, and communal redistribution. In the next chapter, we will examine the legal responses to piracy, the trials, punishments, and propaganda that sought to erase the pirate threat from the seas and from public imagination. Pirate trials were as much about spectacle as they were about justice. Colonial courts, often operating in major port cities like London, Boston, or Port Royal, sought not just to convict pirates, but to send a message to seafarers and merchants alike. The proceedings were public events, drawing large crowds eager to witness notorious outlaws brought to heel. Executions, when carried out, were deliberately theatrical. Pirates were hanged in prominent locations, on docks, riversides, or near harbours, where one of the most infamous execution sites was Execution Dock in Wapping, London. Condemned pirates were paraded through the streets in a cart, accompanied by a chaplain and jeering spectators. At the dock, they were hanged with a shortened rope to prolong suffering, known as the Marshal's Dance. After death, some bodies were tarred and displayed in iron cages along the river as grim warnings to other sailors. The corpses could remain visible for years, a constant reminder of the consequences of piracy. Legal proceedings against pirates often relied on dubious testimony, coerced confessions, or questionable interpretations of maritime law. Defendants had limited access to legal representation, and the burden of proof was not always rigorously upheld. Political motivations sometimes influenced outcomes, particularly when former privateers stood accused. In some cases, pirates were used as scapegoats to deflect blame from corrupt officials or failed naval policy. Colonial governments published broadsides, printed sheets recounting trials and executions to shape public perception. These broadsides combined fact, moral lesson, and sensationalism. They depicted pirates as monstrous figures corrupted by greed and debauchery. Sermons were delivered denouncing piracy as sin, while ballads and pamphlets dramatized pirate violence and divine retribution. The aim was to redefine piracy not as rebellious enterprise, but as criminal degeneracy threatening the moral order. Despite the state's efforts to demonize pirates, public fascination persisted. Some pirates, especially those who resisted tyranny or aided the poor, became folk heroes. Stories of brave sea rovers who defied cruel captains or fought oppressive empires resonated with ordinary people, especially the lower classes. The blurred lines between pirate and rebel, outlaw and adventurer made total vilification difficult. Authorities struggled to maintain a consistent narrative in the face of such ambivalence. This tension between condemnation and romanticism continued in literature. Early accounts of pirate lives, some factual, others wildly embellished, sold well and circulated widely. Captain Charles Johnson's A General History of the Robberies and Murders of the Most Notorious Pirates, first published in 1724, was instrumental in cementing the mythos of the pirate in English-speaking culture. While claiming historical accuracy, the book mixed verified details with conjecture, myth, and moral commentary. Johnson's accounts shaped the legacy of pirates such as Blackbeard, Anne Bonny, and Bartholomew Roberts. His vivid portrayals gave personality and depth to these figures, transforming them into larger-than-life characters. His work inspired later writers and became a cornerstone for the image of the pirate that would endure in novels, plays, and eventually film. This image was one of contradiction, ruthless yet free, violent yet charismatic, doomed yet daring. The actual lives of pirates were rarely so romantic. Most faced poverty, injury, betrayal, and death. Few enjoyed long careers or peaceful retirements. But the legend they left behind endured, in part because it spoke to deeper human desires, the rejection of tyranny, the yearning for freedom, and the dream of fortune won by wit and will. Pirates may have been criminals, but they were also symbols of resistance to the structures that bound ordinary lives. The decline of piracy was not immediate. Even after major figures were executed and key ports closed, pockets of resistance remained. Smuggling, mutiny, and petty privateering continued in various forms. Yet the Golden Age had ended. What remained was a story told and retold, shaped by memory, fear, and fantasy. The next chapter will explore the long cultural AF. As the age of active piracy faded into history, the stories of those who had sailed under the black flag began to evolve into something far larger than the lives they actually lived. Pirates became more than historical figures. They turned into legends. Their images and reputations were reshaped by writers, artists, and political thinkers, each of whom projected onto them the values or warnings most relevant to their times. From the 18th century onward, the legacy of piracy was molded as much by story. The earliest transformation of pirate identity came through published memoirs and fictionalized biographies. While some of these texts were rooted in fact, they were also shaped by public appetite for sensationalism. Captain Charles Johnson's A General History of the Robberies and Murders of the Most Notorious Pirates, first printed in 1724, was pivotal. Its detailed, dramatic, and morally framed accounts painted pirates as dangerous yet strangely admirable figures, bold in their rebellion, loyal to. Johnson's book was wildly popular and soon translated into other languages. It influenced a generation of readers and provided material for dramatizations and serial publications. Some accounts in the book were likely exaggerated or even invented, but their effect was undeniable. They gave names and faces to once shadowy figures, transforming the likes of Blackbeard, Anne Bonny, and Bartholomew Roberts into enduring characters in the Western imagination. The pirates were framed as anti-heroes rather than. By the end of the 18th century, the Age of Enlightenment had brought with it new attitudes toward freedom, authority, and social order. Pirates, though still considered criminals, began to be seen in some quarters as symbols of individual liberty. Philosophers and political radicals occasionally referenced pirate societies as early examples of egalitarian governance. These interpretations were often romanticized, but they reflected genuine admiration for the pirates' apparent rejection of monarchy, class. During the 19th century, the pirate story underwent further transformation. With the decline of real piracy, its depiction shifted into romantic fiction and children's literature. One of the most influential works was Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, published in 1883. The novel introduced the world to characters like Long John Silver, the parrot-toting, peg-legged rogue whose charm and cunning made him one of literature's most famous anti-heroes. Stevenson drew from earlier sources, including this romantic image was far removed from the grim reality of pirate life. The hunger, disease, violence, and betrayal that marked the historical experience were often omitted or softened. Instead, pirates became adventurers on the high seas, seeking treasure, escaping the law, and living free. Their portrayal became one of escapism rather than history, a trend that only deepened in the 20th century with the advent of cinema and popular entertainment. Hollywood embraced the pirate genre with enthusiasm. Films like Captain Blood, 1935, and The Seahawk, 1940, starring Errol Flynn, created a template for the dashing, sword-fighting pirate hero. These movies emphasized honor, romance, and swashbuckling adventure. Villains were often corrupt officials or rival pirates, while the protagonists upheld their own code of justice. Though rooted in fantasy, these portrayals influenced public perception more than any academic work or historical study. The image of the pirate continued to evolve through the century. In post-war media, especially during the 1950s and 60s, pirates were featured in comic books, television shows, and themed attractions. The Disneyland ride, Pirates of the Caribbean, opened in 1967, became an iconic experience that merged folklore with immersive storytelling. The ride's success reinforced the idea of pirates as playful rogues, humorous and harmless, more interested in drinking and singing than plundering and killing. By the early 21st century, the image of the pirate was as diverse as the cultures interpreting it. Films like the Pirates of the Caribbean series reimagined piracy as part of a supernatural, chaotic world filled with curses, monsters, and ancient legends. The character of Captain Jack Sparrow, portrayed by Johnny Depp, became a cultural phenomenon. His eccentricity, wit, and ambiguous morality appealed to audiences worldwide. While the series acknowledged darker elements of piracy, it largely maintained, beyond entertainment, piracy became a lens through which people explored rebellion, independence, and identity. Pirate flags, especially the Jolly Roger, were adopted by subcultures as symbols of defiance. Activist groups, hackers, and artists used pirate imagery to challenge authority, critique capitalism, or advocate for freedom of information. The very term pirate was reclaimed in various contexts, not as criminal, but as visionary outsider. Despite, or perhaps because of, its distance from historical accuracy, the myth of the pirate endured. Educational programs, museums, and documentaries attempted to re-anchor the narrative, in fact, highlighting the brutality, racism, and exploitation often glossed over in fiction. Yet the romantic image persisted, revealing how deeply rooted the legend had become. It was not just the memory of pirates that endured, but the idea of what they represented. A rejection of order, a pursuit of freedom, and even in regions where modern piracy remained a real and violent threat, the cultural pirate, swashbuckling and sardonic, was largely separate from the reality of maritime crime. Somali pirates, for instance, drew global headlines for hijacking commercial vessels, but they were not folded into the romantic tradition. Instead, the divide between myth and reality became starker, emphasizing how fictionalized the classic image of the pirate had become in global consciousness. Yet the persistence of the pirate myth is not simply a quirk of nostalgia or escapism. At its core, the image of the pirate resonates because it embodies a kind of utopian defiance. In every era, individuals and communities have looked to pirates as metaphors for resistance against oppressive systems, economic exploitation, and rigid hierarchies. The idea that a person could abandon society's rules, set sail, and create a new order on the sea has enduring appeal. It is a dream of liberation, however Academic historians have worked to reclaim the truth of the pirate world, emphasizing the lived experiences of those who chose or were forced into piracy. These studies explore not only the political and economic structures that made piracy possible, but also the social dynamics aboard pirate vessels, the role of women, the influence of African and indigenous crew members, and the diversity of motivations that led people to the Black Flag. Far from being a monolithic group, pirates represented a mosaic. Piracy also continues to serve as a tool for critical reflection on empire and colonialism. In the narratives of colonial expansion, pirates were often cast as villains disrupting the supposedly civilizing mission of European powers. But modern interpretations challenge this framing, suggesting that pirates exposed the exploitative nature of empire by attacking its infrastructure and redistributing its wealth, albeit often violently and without altruism. Some historians argue that piracy reveals the inst. Museums and exhibitions around the world have increasingly embraced this nuanced approach. Displays in institutions such as the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich or the Pirates of Nassau Museum in the Bahamas present piracy not merely as adventure, but as a complex historical phenomenon tied to global systems of labor, race, and power. Artifacts recovered from shipwrecks, cannons, cutlasses, coins, and personal belongings offer tangible connections to lives long mythologized. These objects help bridge. In literature, piracy remains fertile ground for reimagining identity and agency. Contemporary authors have placed pirates in speculative and alternate histories, examined their lives through feminist and post-colonial lenses, and used pirate stories to question power and morality. Children's literature, young adult fiction, and graphic novels continue to feature pirate protagonists, blending history and fantasy in ways that both entertain and educate. The pirate, endlessly adaptable, serves as a blank In the digital age, the concept of piracy has taken on new forms. The term now applies to the unauthorized copying and distribution of media, music, films, software, books, raising questions about ownership, access, and the ethics of information sharing. Digital pirates are often portrayed as the heirs to the swashbucklers of old, disruptive, clever, and anti-authoritarian. Although far removed from the blood and salt of the sea, this metaphor reinforces how deeply piracy has embedded itself in modern. Festivals, reenactments, and fan communities continue to celebrate the pirate legacy with gusto. Events such as Gasparilla in Tampa, Florida, or the Pirate Festival in Hastings, England, draw thousands of participants dressed in tricorn hats, eye patches, and flowing coats. These gatherings, while rarely focused on historical accuracy, serve as spaces for collective imagination and playful rebellion. They echo the same spirit that drew men and women to piracy centuries ago, a desire to escape the ordinary. Though the historical Golden Age of Piracy lasted less than a century, its cultural echo has endured for over 300 years. From violent outlaws to beloved anti-heroes, pirates have transformed from feared enemies of the state into symbols of freedom, creativity, and dissent. Their story, shaped by countless retellings, speaks to the enduring human fascination with those who live outside the law, and what that might mean long before piracy emerged as a widespread threat in the Atlantic world. The foundation for its rise was laid through the dynamics of European exploration, colonization, and naval warfare. The Age of Discovery, beginning in the late 15th century, opened vast new territories and sea routes for European powers. Spain and Portugal initially led the charge, carving out empires in the Americas, Africa, and Asia, and shipping enormous quantities of wealth, particularly silver and gold, back to Europe. These are, as maritime empires expanded, so too did the importance of protecting and disrupting trade. The Spanish treasure fleets, or flotas, became famous targets. Sailing annually from the New World to Spain, these convoys carried bullion mined from Peru and Mexico, along with precious goods from across the empire. To protect these ships, Spain developed a system of armed escorts and coordinated departures. Yet the allure of such concentrated wealth proved irresistible. Rival powers and opportunists soon sought. Privateering emerged as a sanctioned form of piracy, deeply embedded in the politics of early modern Europe. During times of war, governments issued letters of marque to private ship owners, authorizing them to attack and capture enemy vessels. These privateers operated legally under national flags, and their activities were seen as extensions of state warfare. England, in particular, made extensive use of privateers during its conflicts with Spain and France. Figures such as Francis Drake and John Hawke. Drake's circumnavigation of the globe between 1577 and 1580, conducted largely as a raiding mission against Spanish holdings, earned him immense wealth and a knighthood from Queen Elizabeth II. To the Spanish, however, he was nothing more than a pirate. This dual identity, hero to some, criminal to others, became a recurring theme in the history of maritime raiders. The lines between privateering and piracy blurred further when war ended. Many privateers, now unemployed, continued their attacks without aught. The rise of chartered trading companies like the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company introduced new dimensions to maritime conflict. These organizations operated their own ships, maintained private armies, and wielded enormous political influence. They often clashed with independent seafarers, viewing unauthorized trade or disruption as piracy, even when carried out by nationals of their own country. In this environment, piracy became as much an issue of economic control as its way. Colonial settlements, particularly in the Caribbean and North America, grew rapidly during the 17th century. These outposts required constant supply lines from Europe and Africa, forming the notorious triangular trade network. Manufactured goods from Europe were exchanged in Africa for enslaved people, who were transported across the Atlantic to the Americas, where their labor produced raw materials sent back to Europe. This system generated immense profits, but was heavily reliant on vulnerable shipping. The Atlantic Ocean became a contested arena, with ships from various nations transporting cargo, troops, and enslaved people through perilous waters. Naval escorts were limited, and many merchant ships sailed with minimal defenses. Pirates exploited this weakness, striking quickly and retreating to hidden bases. Their success highlighted the fragile nature of colonial logistics and the overextension of European naval power in distant waters. Tensions between European powers often escalated into open conflict overseas. Wars fought on the continent reverberated across the oceans, turning colonies into battlegrounds. During the War of the Spanish Succession, 1701-1714, for example, naval engagements intensified in the Caribbean, and privateers flourished under renewed letters of marque. But when the war ended, thousands of sailors were left adrift, armed, experienced, and without employment. It was from this population that many of the most the social composition of pirate crews reflected this dislocation. Many were former Navy men, discharged without compensation. Others were escaped indentured servants, displaced peasants, or mariners fleeing harsh discipline aboard merchant vessels. Their grievances were not simply economic. They resented the hierarchy, brutality, and corruption of the maritime world. Piracy offered not just income, but autonomy, a chance to live under rules they helped create. While empires framed piracy as lawlessness, pirates often operated within their own legal codes. They justified their actions as responses to injustice, interpreting their raids not as theft, but as retribution against exploitative systems. Some even produced written defenses of their actions, arguing that they had been wronged by corrupt governors or cheated by merchants. These justifications, though self-serving, reveal the ideological complexity beneath the violence. In many cases, piracy was deeply entangled with local politics. Colonial governors might tolerate pirates who spent lavishly in port or defended against rival powers. Merchants welcomed the influx of cheap goods, and ordinary settlers viewed pirates as folk heroes rather than criminals. This ambiguous relationship made it difficult for imperial powers to enforce anti-piracy laws. Suppression campaigns often required not just naval force, but political restructuring and economic alternatives to piracy's inf. The decline of Spanish naval supremacy in the 17th century also contributed to the rise of piracy. With fewer resources to protect its transatlantic fleets, Spain became increasingly vulnerable. Other nations capitalized on this weakness, seizing territories and trade routes. Pirates, both sanctioned and unsanctioned, filled the vacuum. The Caribbean, with its maze of islands and strategic shipping lanes, became a hotspot for maritime conflict and a refuge for outlaws. Pirate bases, such as those on Tortuga and New Providence, provided infrastructure for extended campaigns. These settlements offered safe harbour, access to supplies, and opportunities to repair ships and recruit crew. They also became cultural melting pots, attracting seafarers of many backgrounds. The relative freedom and equality found in these enclaves contrasted sharply with the rigid social order of colonial settlements. Pirates learned to exploit not only geography, but also the rhythms of commerce. They tracked trade seasons, understood the schedules of treasure fleets, and built intelligence networks through informants in port cities. This operational sophistication belied the popular image of pirates as reckless marauders. In truth, many successful pirate captains were disciplined, calculating leaders who ran their ships with efficiency and enforced codes of conduct among their crews. The rise of piracy, then, was not an accident of history, but the result of systemic tensions within the early modern maritime world. It emerged at the intersection of imperial ambition, commercial expansion, labour exploitation, and social unrest. Understanding this context reveals piracy as more than a criminal phenomenon. It was also a reaction, a form of resistance shaped by the very forces that sought to suppress it. Piracy was not only a response to imperial policies, but also a reflection of the gaps and contradictions within them. While empires claimed to bring law, order, and civilization to the seas, their actions often contradicted these ideals. The use of privateers, the exploitation of sailors, and the manipulation of legal systems revealed a world in which legitimacy was fluid and power was frequently exercised through violence and opportunism. Pirates, in their own way, exposed this hypocrisy, forcing empty pirate communities, though temporary and vulnerable, experimented with governance models rarely found elsewhere in the 17th and early 18th centuries. Shipboard democracy, profit sharing, and collective decision-making offered alternatives to the authoritarian norms of naval and merchant service. Leadership was conditional, not absolute. Discipline was often harsh but rooted in shared consent. These practices did not make pirates idealistic revolutionaries, but they did show that even in desperate conduct, religion played a curious role aboard pirate ships. While many pirates were nominally Christian, few adhered to orthodox practices. Churches and clergy were largely absent from pirate communities, and the rituals of organized faith were often replaced with toasts, superstitions, and informal rites. Yet pirates were not without a sense of the sacred. They observed omens, respected symbols of luck, and occasionally held funerals for fallen comrades. Some even kept Bibles, not necessarily for worship, but as the relationship between pirates and enslaved people was complex and varied. Some pirate crews included Africans who had escaped bondage or been freed during raids. In a few cases, pirates liberated slaves from captured ships and allowed them to join the crew as equals. This practice was not universal, and some pirates participated in the slave trade or treated captives brutally. Still, the presence of free black pirates challenged the racial hierarchies of the time and hinted at more fluid social era. These contradictions defined pirate life. It was a world of freedom and danger, autonomy and violence, community and betrayal. Pirates were neither heroes nor merely villains. They were products of their time, shaped by the brutal realities of maritime labour, colonial ambition, and economic inequality. Their brief dominion over the seas left an outsized impact, not only on trade routes and naval policy, but on the cultural imagination that followed. The legacy they forged was not built solely on gold, and as the 18th century progressed, the tide began to turn decisively against the pirate way of life. The golden age that had allowed outlaws to flourish on the high seas was coming to an end, driven by a convergence of political will, military strategy, and shifting economic imperatives. European empires, increasingly committed to maintaining uninterrupted trade and consolidating their colonial holdings, turned their attention to eradicating the pirate threat once and for all. The suppression of piracy. The British Crown took the lead in this campaign. With a growing merchant fleet and expanding overseas interests, Britain recognized that piracy threatened not only economic prosperity, but imperial legitimacy. The deployment of naval patrols to the Caribbean, Atlantic, and West African coast intensified. Warships hunted pirates with orders to destroy their vessels and bring survivors to justice. Bounties were offered for the capture of notorious pirates, and former outlaws were enlisted to hunt down the... One of the most significant steps in this campaign was the appointment of Woodes Rogers as Royal Governor of the Bahamas in 1718. A former privateer himself, Rogers understood both the tactics of pirates and the weaknesses of colonial defences. He arrived in Nassau, long a pirate stronghold, with a fleet of warships and a royal pardon for those willing to surrender. Many accepted the offer, weary of life on the run and tempted by the chance to reintegrate into colonial society. Rogers worked swiftly to... However, not all pirates agreed to lay down their arms. Charles Vane, one of the most defiant, refused the pardon and fled Nassau, continuing his attacks on shipping. His intransigence eventually led to his downfall. After alienating his own crew through erratic behaviour, he was deposed, captured, and returned to Jamaica for trial. In 1721, he was hanged, his body displayed as a warning to others. His fate echoed that of other holdouts who found themselves without safe harbours or allies. The Royal Navy's growing presence in the Atlantic played a decisive role in making piracy increasingly untenable. Naval vessels were better armed, more numerous, and more coordinated than in previous decades. New strategies were employed, including convoy systems for merchant ships and the use of smaller, faster vessels to track pirate sloops through shallow waters and along complex coastlines. As a result, pirates found it harder to ambush targets or escape pursuit. Legal reforms also contributed to the decline. Special admiralty courts were established in colonial cities to expedite pirate trials. These courts operated without juries and often with predetermined outcomes. They delivered swift verdicts, and hangings became public spectacles designed to deter future piracy. The spectacle served both legal and theatrical purposes, asserting imperial power while reinforcing the consequences of defying it. Executed pirates were sometimes gibbeted, their tarred bodies... Economic changes further undermined piracy's appeal. As colonial economies stabilized and trade routes became more secure, legitimate opportunities for wealth and employment grew. Naval and merchant service, though still harsh, offered better prospects for advancement than in earlier decades. At the same time, pirate bases were systematically dismantled or reclaimed. The loss of Nassau, Madagascar, and other sanctuaries meant that pirates could no longer count on reliable places to refit, resupply, or arm. By the mid-1720s, the number of active pirate ships had dwindled dramatically. Notorious figures like Blackbeard, Stede Bonnet, Calico Jack Rackham, and Bartholomew Roberts had been killed or captured. Their deaths marked not only the end of individual careers, but also the symbolic close of an era. Bartholomew Roberts, in particular, had represented the height of pirate ambition, commanding a fleet, operating across multiple oceans, and developing a complex pirate code. His death in 1722 during a Nava. Despite these crackdowns, piracy did not vanish completely. Smaller bands of outlaws continued to operate, especially in more remote regions or during times of war. Privateering persisted as a legal grey area, with some individuals toggling between legitimacy and outlawry depending on political circumstances. Smuggling also thrived, particularly in North America, where colonial discontent with British trade restrictions fostered illicit networks that sometimes overlapped with pirate remnants. Piracy's decline was gradual, uneven, and never absolute. But the conditions that had allowed it to flourish were no longer present. The era of small navies and vast, unguarded trade routes was ending. The empires of Europe, more deeply entrenched in their colonial systems, invested in maritime infrastructure and enforcement. Piracy as a large-scale threat had been defeated, though its memory lingered in both fear and fascination. The legacy of piracy's suppression was complex. On the one hand, it restored imperial control and allowed for the smoother operation of global trade. On the other, it revealed the fragility of empire and the need for constant vigilance. The fact that thousands of sailors had once turned to piracy was a testament to the failures of naval discipline, economic inequality, and the brutal treatment of seafarers. The suppression campaigns succeeded militarily, but left unresolved many of the grievances that the world the pirates had briefly disrupted was evolving into something even more interconnected and regulated. Insurance markets, stock exchanges, and transnational trade companies formalized the flows of wealth that pirates had once intercepted. Maritime law expanded to cover the high seas more systematically. New international agreements sought to define piracy clearly and distinguish it from privateering or rebellion. These legal developments codified the very distinctions pirates had blurred even as piracy declined, its psychological grip remained. The image of the pirate continued to haunt merchant captains and inspire seafarers. Naval training included tactics for responding to boarding attempts. Merchant ships were fortified and armed. Ports invested in defences. In some colonies, the memory of pirate raids persisted in folklore, architecture, and family histories. Ghost stories, hidden treasures, and tales of pirate ancestors became part of local identity, blending fact and fiction in The age of sail would eventually give way to the age of steam, and with it, a new chapter in maritime history. But for a few crucial decades, pirates had reigned over vast stretches of ocean, challenging the might of empires with little more than courage, cunning, and communal strength. Their defeat did not erase their impact. The ships they burned, the ports they raided, and the rules they broke left a mark not only on the charts of their time, but on the maritime traditions that followed. The campaigns against piracy also offered opportunities for social reintegration and reinvention. Some former pirates, having accepted royal pardons, settled into civilian life. They became merchants, farmers, or even colonial officials. Their pasts were sometimes buried or quietly acknowledged, depending on the political climate. A few retained notoriety in local folklore, becoming minor celebrities or cautionary tales for younger generations. Others disappeared entirely from public view. Their names. Naval officers who led anti-pirate operations often parlayed their successes into career advancement. Their triumphs were celebrated in newspapers, journals, and official dispatches. Commemorative medals were issued and portraits commissioned. These victories helped to forge a narrative of imperial strength and justice, a story of order restored through decisive action and moral clarity. Yet the reality behind these narratives was more complex, often involving political bargaining, economic motivation. The transition from pirate-infested waters to regulated maritime space was not instantaneous. It required decades of administrative work, including the building of coastal forts, the drafting of treaties, and the establishment of customs houses and naval stations. In many ways, the suppression of piracy marked the beginning of the modern era of maritime governance. Naval hydrography, port registration systems, and standardized shipping codes all followed in the wake of efforts to eliminate piracy. Colonial populations did not always welcome these changes. The same officials who cracked down on piracy often imposed taxes, trade restrictions, and legal reforms that benefited imperial centers at the expense of local communities. In some cases, former pirate sympathizers turned to smuggling or resistance, fueling cycles of unrest. The boundary between law and outlawry remained porous, shaped more by power dynamics than principle. Pirate suppression had strengthened the state, but it had not eliminated. As imperial control tightened, the memory of piracy was repackaged for public consumption. Ballads, plays, and serialized tales romanticized the exploits of sea robbers long after they had vanished. Writers reimagined pirates not as threats to civilization, but as tragic figures resisting oppression. The tension between the pirate as criminal and the pirate as rebel became a cultural battleground, one that continues to this day in books, films, and academic debate. Piracy's end as a dominant force did not signal the end of maritime defiance. New forms of resistance would arise: mutinies, revolutions, and labor strikes, all drawing in subtle ways from the traditions of autonomy and solidarity that had once thrived aboard pirate ships. The sea remained a space of possibility, even as its horizons were mapped, patrolled, and legislated by empire. As the age of piracy faded into history, the oceans did not become entirely peaceful, nor did the disappearance of pirate enclaves signify a complete end to maritime lawlessness. Instead, new forms of conflict and competition emerged on the seas, shaped by the same imperial ambitions and global commerce that had once nourished piracy. In many cases, the suppression of piracy cleared the way for more systematic exploitation by colonial powers, and the legacies of the pirates were absorbed into broader. The Caribbean, once dotted with pirate strongholds, became more tightly controlled by European powers. British, French, Spanish, and Dutch colonies developed stronger fortifications, more centralized administrations, and improved naval logistics. In place of informal agreements and smuggling economies, governors implemented customs regimes and military oversight. The region's ports were gradually transformed from chaotic hubs of black market trade into organized centers of commerce tied directly to This transformation required significant investment in infrastructure and surveillance. Coastal fortresses were reinforced with stone batteries and improved cannon emplacements. Harbors were dredged to accommodate larger warships. Watchtowers and signaling systems were constructed to monitor maritime traffic. Governors and naval commanders coordinated more closely, sharing intelligence and standardizing their responses to illegal activity. Piracy had taught empires a costly lesson: to control the seas. With this increasing order came a shift in who benefited from maritime wealth. Whereas pirates had once distributed plunder among crews with remarkable equality, the post-pirate economy concentrated profits in fewer hands. Wealth generated by sugar, tobacco, and slave labor flowed into the coffers of merchant elites and imperial treasuries. The laboring classes, sailors, plantation workers, dock hands, remained poorly paid and tightly controlled. Pirates had briefly interrupted this system, offering an The abolition of piracy also contributed to the rise of naval professionalism. The Royal Navy, once stretched thin and reactive, expanded its training programs, commissioned more ships, and enforced discipline more consistently. Officers advanced through meritocratic systems shaped by experience and examination rather than patronage alone. Naval strategy evolved, emphasizing global reach and sustained presence rather than opportunistic battles. These changes laid the foundation for future dominance by B. While the Golden Age of Piracy ended in the 1720s, the threat of piracy persisted in other regions. The Barbary coast of North Africa remained a center of state-sponsored corsair activity, where European and American vessels were routinely captured and held for ransom. These so-called Barbary pirates operated under the sanction of local rulers and targeted Christian shipping in the Mediterranean. European powers responded with diplomacy, tribute payments, and occasional military expeditions. In Southeast Asia and the South China Sea, piracy remained a deeply rooted problem well into the 19th century. Maritime raiding was part of the political and economic landscape, often tied to local power struggles. Chinese, Malay, and Vietnamese pirate fleets operated along extensive networks, preying on merchant junks, colonial shipping, and rival polities. These pirates were sometimes backed by local warlords or kingdoms, blurring the line between criminality and political insurgency. The persistence of piracy in these regions demonstrated that it was not a uniquely European phenomenon, nor one confined to a single century. Rather, it was a global expression of maritime resistance and opportunism. In many cases, pirates filled voids left by absent or corrupt governance, offering security and economic alternatives where formal authority was weak. Their suppression required not only naval action, but systemic political and economic reform. By the dawn of the 19th century, international efforts to police the seas intensified. The rise of naval cooperation, the standardization of maritime law, and the development of steam-powered vessels gave states new tools to assert control. Piracy was increasingly framed as a threat to civilization and commerce, and its suppression was portrayed as a moral imperative. Colonial empires positioned themselves as guarantors of safe navigation, even as they pursued their own extractive agendas under the ban. The concept of piracy evolved accordingly. No longer seen simply as robbery at sea, piracy became associated with rebellion, terrorism, and subversion. The legal definition expanded and the rhetoric surrounding piracy became more politicized. Writers and statesmen drew sharp distinctions between legitimate and illegitimate violence, often ignoring the imperial violence embedded in trade monopolies, forced labor, and territorial conquest. Pirates were demonized while empire was sanctified, even though Despite this rebranding, the romantic image of the pirate endured, particularly in regions that had once suffered from or profited by their presence. In port cities where pirates had once spent their loot and lived among the populace, folklore developed that blended fear with nostalgia. Local legends spoke of buried treasure, spectral ships, and ghostly captains who returned with the fog. These stories persisted not because they were true, but because they served a cultural purpose, reminding community. Historians in the 19th and early 20th centuries approached piracy with greater critical distance. Drawing on court records, ship logs, and colonial correspondence, they attempted to distinguish myth from fact. Their findings confirmed much of the brutality and opportunism behind pirate activity, but also revealed the systemic failings that had made piracy viable in the first place. Poor governance, overextended navies, and exploitative labor practices all played a role in shaping the world that pirates. Some scholars began to see pirate societies as laboratories of alternative governance. Their shipboard democracies, equal pay structures, and collective decision-making offered points of comparison to emerging ideas about labor rights and political participation. The Pirate Code, once dismissed as folklore, was analysed for its legal structure and enforcement mechanisms. It became clear that pirates were not merely disorderly criminals, but agents of adaptation, crafting rules to suit the volatile world. This reinterpretation did not excuse pirate violence, nor did it portray them as revolutionaries. But it did provide a more complete understanding of their role in the early modern world. Pirates challenged the monopoly of violence claimed by states, disrupted unjust trade systems, and temporarily inverted hierarchies. Their communities were flawed and often short-lived, but they raised enduring questions about power, legitimacy, and freedom. In this sense, their disappearance marked not only the end of the study of piracy, also revealed how empires had used their enemies to define themselves. The image of the pirate, lawless, greedy, savage, helped colonial powers construct a moral contrast that justified their own expansion and militarization. In this narrative, piracy was not merely a threat, it was a foil for imperial virtue. This framing ignored the brutal realities of empire, enslavement, dispossession, and forced labor carried out in the name of civilization. Pirates, though often ruthless, modern historiography continued to develop these perspectives, drawing on interdisciplinary methods to examine piracy as a social, economic, and cultural phenomenon. Anthropologists, legal scholars, and literary critics contributed to a broader conversation about how piracy functioned in different contexts. They explored pirate identities, gender dynamics aboard ships, and the transmission of pirate folklore across generations. Through this lens, piracy emerged not as a singular historical episode, but these scholarly efforts were mirrored by public interest. Pirate museums opened in coastal cities around the world. Academic conferences and exhibitions explored the realities behind the myths. Documentaries, historical novels, and digital archives made primary sources more accessible to general audiences. The pirate, once reduced to caricature, began to reappear as a multifaceted figure. Part criminal, part rebel, part worker in a global maritime system. This evolving understanding helped demystify even today, the relevance of piracy persists in new forms. Maritime piracy continues in regions where governance is weak and economic desperation acute. Off the coast of Somalia, in the Strait of Malacca, and in the Gulf of Guinea, modern pirates threaten commercial shipping, hold crews for ransom, and challenge international naval patrols. These 21st century pirates differ greatly from their early modern predecessors, yet their emergence underscores familiar themes: political instability, lack of economy. Unlike the Golden Age pirates, modern sea raiders rarely espouse ideological causes or challenge imperial systems. But their existence still prompts reflection on global inequality and the securitization of trade. The international response, led by coalitions of naval forces and supported by private security firms, reveals how seriously maritime powers continue to take the threat of piracy. It is not only a matter of protecting cargo, but of preserving the illusion of an orderly, lawful ocean. The sea remains, in many ways, a contested space. Though claimed and patrolled, it resists total control. Storms, migration, smuggling, and piracy all testify to its fluid boundaries and enduring mystery. While the romantic image of the pirate flourished in literature and popular imagination, the historical record remained complex, layered, and often contradictory. Archives across Europe and the Americas preserved court documents, ship logs, correspondence, and merchant records that revealed the daily realities of piracy. These sources documented not just high seas drama, but also the mundane and brutal rhythms of pirate life: hunger, disease, desertion, and the constant negotiation of survival. The archives also revealed how deeply piracy had penetrated colonial societies. It was not simply an external threat to be repelled, but an internal symptom of wider economic and political dysfunction. Merchants purchased stolen goods, dock workers helped hide contraband, and local officials accepted bribes or turned blind eyes. In some cases, colonial governors used pirates as informal naval forces, deploying them to harass enemy trade or suppress rebellion. These relationships were pragmatic, if not all. One of the most revealing aspects of the historical record was the degree to which pirate crews functioned as social microcosms. While they were often brutal and authoritarian in battle, their internal organization could be surprisingly egalitarian. Crews voted on leadership, divided spoils according to pre-agreed shares, and upheld codes that regulated behavior. Violators were punished not through whim, but through procedures outlined in the ship's articles. This contrast with the autocratic structure of such systems were not born from ideology, but from necessity. In the confined and perilous world of the pirate ship, cohesion and mutual respect were essential to survival. A mutiny could doom the entire crew, and unjust leadership could provoke dissent at the worst possible moment. By allowing input from all members and distributing risk and reward, pirate communities fostered a sense of collective purpose, even as they committed acts of violence and theft. These dynamics made them unusually resilient. The demographic composition of pirate crews also reflected broader patterns of displacement and migration. Many pirates were former sailors from European navies or merchant fleets, but others came from vastly different backgrounds. Africans, indigenous people, and Creoles served alongside Irish, English, French, and Dutch crewmen. Some were escaped slaves, others were conscripts or captives who chose piracy over forced labor. While not free of racism or hierarchy, pirate ships often provided more opportunity. This diversity had practical as well as ideological dimensions. Pirates needed manpower, and they were more interested in skill and loyalty than in bloodlines or birthplace. Communication aboard such ships relied on a mix of pidgin languages, gestures, and multilingual orders. Cultural exchange was inevitable, shaping everything from music and food to dress and religious practice. In the cosmopolitan ports where pirates gathered, Nassau, Tortuga, Port Royal, this exchange extended ashore, influencing the medical care aboard pirate vessels was rudimentary but essential. Surgeons, if available, were highly valued. More often, wounded men were treated by fellow crew members using crude tools and folk remedies. Amputations were common after cannon battles, and many pirates bore scars or prosthetics as marks of survival. These injuries reinforced bonds among crew, as tending to the wounded was seen as a communal duty. Pirates developed informal systems of compensation for injury, offering additional shares of entertainment and storytelling played vital roles in maintaining morale. Sea shanties, dice games, card playing, and storytelling sessions helped fill the long, anxious hours between raids or voyages. These tales served not just as diversions, but as repositories of collective memory. They preserved the reputations of captains, recounted the dangers of battle, and warned against treachery. Over time, these oral traditions merged with public folklore, contributing to the mythologization of piracy. Pirates also developed unique symbols and rituals. The Jolly Roger, with its variations of skulls, bones, hourglasses, and bleeding hearts, became a powerful emblem of terror and identity. It signaled that the ship flying it offered a choice: surrender or die. Rituals surrounding the hoisting of the flag, the distribution of loot, or the election of a captain lent structure to a life that was otherwise unpredictable and violent. These practices created a shared sense of belonging and purpose. Justice aboard pirate ships was swift and harsh. Crimes such as theft, desertion, or striking a fellow crewman were punished according to the ship's code. Punishments included flogging, marooning, or even execution. Yet many pirates preferred this system to the arbitrary punishments meted out in the Navy, where flogging could be imposed for minor infractions and appeals were rarely heard. Pirate discipline, for all its brutality, was often more transparent and consistent than that found aboard legal vessels. Pirates were not unaware of their precarious position in the world. Many understood that their careers would be short and their ends violent. They lived with an urgency that shaped their values. Generosity, loyalty, and courage were prized, while cowardice and greed were despised. Some wrote letters to loved ones, left wills, or confessed to priests before battle. Others faced death with indifference or bravado, clinging to the idea that their choices, however destructive, had at least been their own. The impact of piracy on maritime law was profound. In response to the threat they posed, European powers expanded their legal frameworks to define and prosecute piracy more effectively. Universal jurisdiction was asserted, allowing any nation to try pirates regardless of nationality. This principle laid the groundwork for modern international law. It also raised questions about sovereignty, legitimacy, and the extent to which states could police the high seas. Piracy thus contributed not only to the history of crime, but to the development of legal thought. Treatises, court rulings, and parliamentary debates cited piracy when discussing issues of jurisdiction, punishment, and state power. The figure of the pirate became a legal abstraction, a test case for the boundaries of authority in a globalizing world. In this sense, pirates helped shape the very institutions that would later erase them from the seas. As archives opened to scholars and public interest grew, these deeper insights into pirate life began to circulate more widely. Museums staged exhibitions on the real lives of pirates. Universities offered courses that examined piracy through lenses of gender, race, and class. Documentary filmmakers and novelists drew upon primary sources to create more accurate portrayals. The result was a richer, more honest understanding of what piracy had been. Not simply an adventure, but a social phenomenon born of the gradual reintegration of pirate history into mainstream historical narratives signaled a broader shift in how we understand deviance and authority. No longer seen purely as lawless marauders, pirates were increasingly viewed as historical agents responding to the brutal constraints of their world. Their resistance, however self-serving, illuminated the violence and inequities of early capitalism, colonial expansion, and maritime empire. By confronting the systems that oppressed them, pirates exposed. At the same time, the allure of the pirate myth remained potent. Even as scholars deconstructed romanticized portrayals, the figure of the pirate continued to capture public imagination. This duality, between critique and celebration, revealed the enduring symbolic power of piracy. Pirates offered a language of resistance that could be adapted across centuries and cultures, from anti-colonial uprisings to internet activism. They became metaphors for freedom, rebellion, and the possibility of remaking the tension between fact and fiction, violence and liberty, order and chaos defined the pirate experience. Pirates navigated not only the physical dangers of storms, hunger, and naval pursuit, but also the moral ambiguities of their trade. They stole, fought, and killed, but they also created, imagined, and endured. Their ships were floating laboratories of survival, improvisation, and negotiation. They made rules when none existed, enforced justice where law had failed, and built communities in the teat. Pirate life was fleeting, but its impact rippled outward. It influenced maritime law, colonial policy, and popular culture. It exposed cracks in the imperial order and tested the limits of naval power. It challenged the morality of empires that claimed to bring civilization through conquest. And it offered, however briefly, a vision of life beyond the reach of kings, governors, and masters. The world in which pirates thrived is gone, replaced by satellite navigation, container ships, and international treaties. Yet the questions they raised about power, inequality, and the human cost of empire remain unresolved. Their lives, preserved in fragments of testimony and myth, continue to provoke, disturb, and inspire. In their defiance, we recognize something deeply human: the refusal to be ruled without reason, and the yearning to live by one's own code, even at the edge of the known world. Though their time was brief, the pirates of the Golden Age carved out a space in history that cannot be ignored. They were not merely figures of fantasy, but real men and women who, for a short time, rewrote the rules of the sea. Their legacy survives not only in archives and artifacts, but in the enduring fascination they inspire. In challenging the world as it was, they helped imagine the world as it might be, and that perhaps is their most lasting treasure. In the aftermath of the Golden Age of Piracy, the maritime world underwent significant transformation. The suppression of piracy had not only brought order to transoceanic trade, but had also marked the beginning of a more coordinated global maritime regime. European empires, increasingly reliant on uninterrupted sea lanes for the movement of goods, people, and capital, invested heavily in naval infrastructure and legal codification. The oceans, once a space of competing sovereignties and renegade acteurs. Among the most lasting changes was the standardization of maritime law. Building upon precedents set during the anti-piracy campaigns, European powers worked to harmonize definitions of piracy, establish admiralty courts across their colonies, and implement systems of port registration and vessel identification. This created a legal framework through which empires could not only prosecute piracy, but also regulate trade and suppress smuggling. The oceans became a zone of surveillance and enforcement. This process was mirrored by a new emphasis on naval professionalism. The British Royal Navy in particular developed into a model for disciplined, hierarchically organized sea power. Training became more systematic, officer ranks were clarified, and logistical systems were expanded to support long-distance campaigns. Other nations followed suit, realizing that maritime supremacy required not only firepower, but coordination, supply chains, and disciplined personnel. The age of the adventurous Captain Jai. As empires secured their maritime interests, they also reconfigured coastal spaces. Port cities became more regimented, with dockside customs offices, military garrisons, and fortified harbours. The irregular economies that had once thrived on piracy and contraband were gradually replaced by regulated commerce and state monopolies. While this brought stability, it also narrowed economic opportunity for the lower classes. Where once an enterprising sailor might turn pirate or smuggler, now he was hemmed by. The Atlantic world was increasingly integrated into a system of imperial capitalism. Sugar, cotton, coffee, and tobacco flowed from plantations worked by enslaved laborers to European markets, where they were refined, taxed, and sold at great profit. Ships carried textiles and firearms to Africa, traded them for human lives, and transported those lives across the ocean in horrific voyages known as the Middle Passage. Pirates had once disrupted this system, their raids on slave ships and plantations. In their absence, there were fewer disruptions to the machinery of empire. The end of large-scale piracy made transatlantic slavery more secure. European powers could transport their human cargo with reduced risk, and plantation owners could export their crops without fear of pirate raids. Insurance markets, once destabilized by maritime violence, stabilized. Shipping firms flourished. Trade volumes increased. The price of imperial security, however, was borne by those at the bottom of the social order. Pirates, for all their violence, had sometimes represented a rupture in this exploitative chain. They operated outside the bounds of national interest and, at times, offered enslaved people freedom in exchange for labor. While not universally abolitionist, some pirate crews included former slaves as equal members, a practice unthinkable on European or colonial ships. Their ships became, if only briefly, floating spaces of relative autonomy in an otherwise brutal system. These moments were rare, but with the suppression of piracy, these alternative spaces disappeared. The plantation system grew more entrenched. Laws tightened around property, race, and maritime conduct. Naval power was increasingly used not to ensure justice, but to protect wealth and maintain hierarchies. The sea was no longer a frontier for rebels, but a highway for empire. Its symbols changed too. The black flag gave way to the ensign, the cutlass to the commission, the oath to the contract. Cultural memory of piracy shifted as well. While 18th century authors had often depicted pirates with a blend of horror and fascination, 19th century portrayals grew more romantic. The pirate became a literary figure, a rogue with charm and conscience, a sea-born Robin Hood. This transformation reflected changing social values. In an industrializing world of wage labor and bureaucratic control, the figure of the freebooter held nostalgic appeal. He was everything the factory worker was not: independent. This image was cemented in plays, novels, and later in films. Yet the real stories of piracy remained buried in court transcripts, colonial dispatches, and sailors' letters. It was not until the 20th century that a more critical historiography emerged, one that sought to recover the voices of those who had lived and died by the cutlass. Scholars pored over shipping manifests, port records, and trial accounts to piece together the lived experiences of pirate crews. Their findings revealed a world far more. They found evidence of multiracial crews, written codes of conduct, and systems of compensation for injury. They traced how pirates formed networks across colonial boundaries and how they operated in tandem with, and sometimes against, local officials. They noted the resilience of pirate communities, their ability to evade capture, and their improvisation in moments of crisis. Most importantly, they uncovered how piracy, though often dismissed as mere criminality, was deeply entwined with the political. This body of research redefined piracy not as a curiosity of the past, but as a window into early modern geopolitics, labor systems, and cultural exchange. It showed how pirates navigated the complexities of empire, both literally and metaphorically. They were shaped by the empires they opposed, and in turn shaped those empires by forcing legal, military, and ideological adaptations. Their legacy was not confined to legend. It was etched into the very structures that succeeded them. Yet this legacy was uneven. In the public imagination, the pirate remained a caricature. He appeared in children's books and amusement park rides, his menace dulled and his politics erased. Meanwhile, modern piracy, whether off the coast of Somalia or in the Strait of Malacca, was treated as a wholly different phenomenon. It was portrayed as disorder without romance, violence without purpose. The long history that connected past and present was rarely acknowledged, though its echoes were unmistakable. The real pirates of history lived hard, often desperate lives. They died young, were betrayed by their comrades, and vanished without graves. But they also created something lasting, a challenge to the maritime order, a refusal to accept their place at the bottom, a brief assertion of agency in a world that offered them none. They became symbols not of crime, but of resistance, however flawed, however fleeting. In the centuries since, many have tried to claim that legacy: revolutionaries, rebels, artists, and even hackers. The pirate flag, once a banner of death, became an emblem of defiance. It appeared in protests, on graffiti walls, and in digital avatars. Though severed from its historical context, the image retained its potency. It reminded people that the sea had once been a place where the rules were different, where power could be challenged and redefined. Piracy, then, was never just about plunder. It was about what people did when they were denied a future, when the world as it was offered no place for them. It was about invention in the face of oppression, about creating community in the midst of chaos. And though it ended in gallows and gibbet cages, it left behind a story too powerful to forget. It is for this reason that piracy continues to resonate, long after the last cannon faded into silence. It was more than crime. It was testimony, It testified to the possibilities that emerged when people stepped outside the structures designed to contain them. Whether those possibilities were ever fully realized is less important than the fact that they were pursued. The pirate ship was not a utopia, but it was an experiment, brief, bloody, and illuminating. Even today, scholars, activists, and storytellers return to that experiment for inspiration. They analyze its failures and its fleeting successes. They ask what it meant to create law where there was none, to build trust in a world of betrayal, to govern without kings or courts. In doing so, they uncover not only the history of piracy, but the history of freedom itself, its costs, its contradictions, and its irrepressible allure. The sea has always invited dreamers and drifters, rebels and rulers. Its vastness suggests escape and encounter, danger and renewal. Pirates understood this. They knew that no empire could truly tame the ocean, that beyond the horizon lay a space where different rules might apply. And so they sailed into that uncertainty, armed with ambition and desperation, driven by necessity and imagination. They failed, most of them, but in failing, they left behind a legacy far larger than their individual lives. They became part of a larger story about struggle, transformation, and the enduring human refusal to be bound by the roles imposed upon them. That story remains with us, not in treasure maps or haunted coves, but in the questions we ask about justice, power, and the possibility of other worlds. As long as ships sail and stories are told, the spirit of the pirate endures. It endures not because of the loot they stole or the ships they sank, but because of the defiance they embodied. In that defiance lies a truth deeper than the ocean, that even in the darkest waters, there are those who choose to sail free. The sea, eternal and unpredictable, has always drawn those willing to challenge the known world. For the pirates of the Golden Age, the ocean was both battlefield and sanctuary, an arena in which the powerless carved out fleeting moments of autonomy. Although the historical pirate was often brutal, self-serving, and short-lived, the larger meaning of piracy remains rooted in its rejection of domination and its challenge to maritime empire. To understand piracy fully is to engage not just with its tale. In many ways, the history of piracy runs parallel to the expansion of European colonialism. As Spain, England, France, and the Netherlands established colonies and exploited new territories, the seas became highways of conquest. Merchant ships carried the spoils of empire, gold, silver, sugar, spices, and human beings across vast oceans, feeding imperial economies. Pirates disrupted this system. They attacked the lifelines of empire, seizing its goods, breaking its laws, and sometimes sheltering those. This antagonism placed pirates in a paradoxical position. They were outlaws, but shaped by the world they opposed. They relied on the same ships, tools, and navigation systems as the merchants and navies they preyed upon. They used colonial ports and traded with the very markets they undermined. Pirates were not revolutionaries in the modern sense. Most sought wealth rather than justice. Yet in resisting their roles within the imperial system, roles often defined by violence, servitude, and scarcity, for historians, tracing the lived experience of pirates is a complex task. The primary sources that survive, court records, naval logs, newspaper reports, were often created by their enemies. These documents focus on transgression and punishment, emphasizing moral failings and sensational crimes. Rarely do they offer insight into the inner lives of pirate crews, their daily routines, or the emotional bonds formed at sea. Yet careful analysis allows glimpses of solidarity, conflict, and shared purpose among. Artifacts recovered from shipwrecks also illuminate the pirate world. Cannons, personal items, coins, tools, and clothing fragments offer tangible links to a past long buried. These objects tell stories absent from official records. They show that pirates valued not just gold, but tobacco, food, clothing, and instruments of survival. They suggest the rhythms of life aboard ship, the need to cook, repair, rest, and prepare for violence. In their material culture, pirates left behind a map of their priority. Museums and research institutions have increasingly preserved and interpreted these materials. Sites like the Wider Pirate Museum in Massachusetts and the Queen Anne's Revenge Conservation Lab in North Carolina present reconstructed narratives based on physical evidence. These exhibits challenge long-standing myths, replacing the flamboyant Hollywood image with one grounded in hardship, ingenuity, and endurance. Visitors learn not only about famous captains, but also about the anonymous crew members who, beyond the Atlantic, the legacy of piracy has also influenced the maritime cultures of Asia, Africa, and the Indian Ocean. In these regions, piracy overlapped with trade, state building, and resistance. The Bugis and Malay raiders of Southeast Asia, the corsairs of North Africa, and the pirates of the Red Sea all engaged in activities that paralleled their Atlantic counterparts. Though shaped by different cultural and political contexts, they too operated on the edges of empire and created networks of These global parallels complicate any simplistic definition of piracy. In many cases, what one state labeled as piracy, another saw as legitimate privateering or political resistance. Legal categories were not fixed, but contested, shaped by power and circumstance. This ambiguity extended to the people who lived in maritime zones. Fishermen, smugglers, traders, and pirates often moved between roles as opportunity demanded. The lines between legal and illegal, sanctioned and outlawed, were fluid and constant. Maritime communities were rarely passive victims. In regions where navies were weak or absent, local populations often negotiated with pirates, providing supplies or intelligence in exchange for protection or economic benefit. Some settlements developed reputations as pirate-friendly ports, welcoming ships regardless of flag. Others resisted piracy, forming militias or appealing to distant authorities for help. These interactions shaped coastal life, embedding piracy in local economies and social reality. Pirate families too left their mark. In some communities, former pirates settled, married, and raised children. Their descendants became farmers, shopkeepers, and sailors. Oral traditions passed down tales of distant battles, lost treasure, and daring escapes. In some places, family names retained a hint of danger or romance. These legacies persisted not because they were always accurate, but because they offered identity and connection to a time when the sea was both peril and promise. As modern states emerged and centralized control grew, these layered relationships faded. Piracy was increasingly seen not as a social phenomenon, but as a crime against international order. Treaties and maritime law framed it as a universal threat, stripping it of nuance. Naval patrols and commercial shipping lanes expanded. The age of the independent mariner gave way to the age of the corporate fleet. The seas were charted, named, fenced in by regulation and insurance. And yet, even as piracy declined, its cultural presence grew. Novels, stage plays, and eventually films turned pirates into legends. They distilled centuries of fear, admiration, and fantasy into characters who defied tyranny and danced along the edge of the world. These fictional pirates bore little resemblance to their historical counterparts, but they carried with them a seed of truth, the idea that freedom, however dangerous, was worth the risk. That idea continues to resonate. In art, music, protest, and literature, the figure of the pirate appears as a symbol of rebellion. He or she is the one who sails outside the lines, who refuses to obey, who lives according to a different logic. In some versions, the pirate is heroic. In others, tragic. But always, the pirate represents a refusal to be bound, a refusal to be broken. In this sense, the pirate is not just a historical figure, but an enduring metaphor. It represents those who exist on the margins, who question the status quo, who imagine another way of living. This metaphor has power because it is rooted in truth. Real people once lived these lives. They fought, they failed, they dreamed. They shaped the seas and left behind echoes in law, language, and lore. To remember them is not to glorify their violence or excuse their crimes. It is to acknowledge the complexity of their world, to see the forces that drove them to piracy, and to understand the choices they made. In doing so, we come closer to understanding not just who they were, but who we are, and who we might become when faced with the impossible. The pirates of the past may not have set out to make statements about justice or autonomy, but their lives, actions, and the structures they created continue to raise fundamental questions. What happens when the law serves the few rather than the many? What forms of order emerge in the absence of state power? And how do people reimagine belonging, fairness, and leadership when they are cast adrift from traditional institutions? These questions are not confined to the past. They arise wherever authority falters, wherever economic desperation meets opportunity, wherever the borders between legitimacy and illegitimacy blur. In refugee flotillas crossing contested waters, in fishing communities resisting overregulation, in online collectives adopting the pirate flag as a symbol of free information, the echoes of the Golden Age can still be felt. The pirate remains an ambiguous figure, one that resists simple interpretation. This ambiguity is its strength. It challenges the tendency to divide history into heroes and villains, lawful and unlawful, civilized and savage. Instead, piracy invites a more nuanced reading of the past, one in which power is questioned, context matters, and resistance is not always noble, but rarely meaningless. Historical memory often sanitizes conflict, sanding off the rough edges of revolt to fit it into national myths. Pirates resist this process. Their legacy cannot be so easily claimed, their actions not so easily justified. This makes them both inconvenient and essential to the story of the modern world. In their refusal to conform, they illuminate the structures others take for granted. For educators, artists, and historians, piracy provides a rich field for exploration. It intersects with discussions of global trade, labor history, maritime law, colonialism, and culture. It opens pathways for critical thinking about the nature of freedom and constraint. And it reminds us that the sea, though charted and commercialized, remains a space where old dreams drift just below the surface. That the pirate continues to capture the imagination is not surprising. He represents escape, but also confrontation, fantasy, but also memory. She navigates the impossible and, in doing so, leaves a map for those still searching. The map may not lead to buried treasure, but it points toward questions worth asking and stories worth telling. The sea has not forgotten its rebels. In the crash of waves against forgotten coves, in the weathered pages of ship logs, in the songs sung far from shore, the pirate endures. They are not always named or praised, but they are there, in the undercurrent, in the whisper of wind in torn sails, reminding us that not all who wander are lost, and not all who defy are forgotten. The influence of piracy extended beyond the oceans into the legal and cultural frameworks of the modern world. What began as outlaw activity gradually became a lens through which people re-examined authority, commerce, and individual agency. Though pirates never established lasting nations or formal political institutions, their legacy can be found in how they challenged the prevailing norms of their time. The mere existence of pirate communities, self-organized, multiracial, and governed by collective. One of the most revealing aspects of pirate governance was its emphasis on participatory decision-making. While not democratic in the modern sense, many pirate crews embraced forms of self-rule unheard of in most early modern institutions. Captains were elected and could be removed by vote. Plunder was shared according to agreed-upon formulas, with compensation for injury or loss. Power was distributed between the captain, who led in battle, and the quartermaster, who represented the interests of the sea. This internal balance was essential to maintaining cohesion. Pirate crews were typically composed of men who had suffered under brutal naval regimes or exploitative merchant contracts. Many had experienced flogging, starvation, and forced conscription. On pirate ships, by contrast, they found a system that, while still dangerous and often violent, allowed for some degree of autonomy. The Articles of Agreement, signed by each crew member, were binding social contracts. They delineated rights and responsi. Such practices foreshadowed later developments in labour organisation and maritime law. Though pirates were not unionists in the modern sense, their insistence on fair shares and limits on arbitrary authority echoed principles that would later underpin sailors' unions and labour codes. In resisting the rigid hierarchy of maritime empires, pirates created proto-egalitarian systems that gave voice to those who had been silenced. Their influence lived on, not in manifestos, but in the quiet expectations of The gender dynamics aboard pirate vessels also challenge assumptions about early modern society. While piracy was overwhelmingly male-dominated, the presence of women like Anne Bonny and Mary Read complicates the narrative. These women disguised themselves to gain passage, fought alongside their male counterparts, and earned reputations for courage and cruelty alike. Their stories became legendary, but they also shed light on the limited choices available to women at the time, and the radical nature of Bonny and Read's participation underscores how pirate life could offer an escape not just from poverty or punishment, but from rigid social roles. In this way, piracy served as an arena for reinvention. Men who had been flogged for insubordination became commanders. Women who had been excluded from public life became warriors. Outcasts became allies. This fluidity of identity, while not universal or unproblematic, was part of what made piracy so threatening to the established order. It showed that the cultural and ethnic diversity was another hallmark of pirate communities. Aboard pirate ships, one might find Englishmen, Africans, Frenchmen, escaped slaves, Irishmen, indigenous sailors, and more. While racial prejudice was not absent, survival often depended on cooperation across lines of origin and appearance. Crews were judged by ability and loyalty more than background. This stood in contrast to the rigid racial and class hierarchies of colonial society, making pirate ships not only dangerous, but some pirate vessels even granted freedom to enslaved people captured during raids, offering them a place among the crew. While such decisions were often practical rather than moral, they nonetheless disrupted the racial order of the Atlantic world. These moments, isolated but real, were radical acts in a world where human beings were bought and sold. They serve as reminders that, for all its violence and criminality, piracy sometimes created space for alternative social arrangements. These arrangements were fragile and temporary. Pirate ships were vulnerable to storms, mutinies, betrayal, and pursuit. Most pirates did not survive long. Naval forces grew increasingly aggressive in tracking them down, and colonial governments became less tolerant of the informal economies that had once sustained pirate activity. Pardons became rarer and punishments more severe. By the 1730s, the age of the great pirate fleets had ended, and only scattered holdouts remained. The end of piracy was not simply a matter of firepower, but of containment. Empires expanded their surveillance networks, standardized maritime law, and reasserted control over port cities. The oceans, once full of contested zones and rogue actors, became increasingly regulated. Pirates had briefly revealed the limits of empire, but in their defeat, those limits were redrawn. Order returned, but it was a harder, more bureaucratic order, one designed to prevent not just piracy, but the conditions that mar. This transformation had lasting consequences. The navies that had hunted pirates became instruments of colonial enforcement. The same ports that had welcomed black market goods now policed trade routes and taxed every shipment. The laws written to prosecute pirates were expanded to cover smugglers, mutineers, and even political dissidents. The figure of the pirate, once feared for his unpredictability, became a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when people resist the system too effectively. Yet the system remained imperfect. Inequality persisted. Labor exploitation continued. New forms of rebellion emerged, and with them, new kinds of pirates. In later centuries, privateers, smugglers, revolutionaries, and mercenaries all drew on pirate traditions. They adapted the language, tactics, and symbols of the Golden Age to suit their needs. Flags changed, weapons evolved, but the spirit of maritime defiance endured. Modern piracy, too, owes something to its predecessors. Whether in the waters of West Africa, the South China Sea, or the Gulf of Aden, today's pirates operate under different conditions but with familiar motives: poverty, exclusion, and the promise of profit. They attack oil tankers instead of galleons, demand ransoms instead of treasure, but their actions continue to challenge global security and commerce. The same questions remain about law, legitimacy, and the costs of an unequal world. In recent decades, piracy has even become a lens for rethinking digital life. The term has been adopted by groups advocating for open access to information, challenging intellectual property laws, and resisting corporate monopolies. The pirate in this context is no longer a sailor, but a coder, a user, a dissenter. The metaphor persists because it taps into something essential: the desire to reclaim agency in systems that appear closed or exploitative. Through these adaptations, the figure of the pirate has become a mirror. It reflects our fears and fantasies, our desire for freedom, and our anxiety about disorder. It reminds us that history is not a straight line, but a sea of possibilities, some lost, others waiting to be rediscovered. The symbolic weight of piracy has grown even as its material reality has changed. It has become shorthand for questioning norms, breaking barriers, and forging paths where none officially exist. In literature, pirates stand beside other archetypes of resistance: the outlaw, the rebel, the trickster, each expressing discontent with the dominant order. Yet the pirate's domain is unique, a space unmoored from borders, adrift from national identity, shaped by tides and storms and the constant movement of shy. Pirates remind us that every structure has a shadow, every system its fugitives. They inhabited that shadow willingly, knowing it brought danger, but also opportunity. Some found fame, most found death, but all took part in something larger than themselves, a current of disobedience that ran beneath the surface of empire. Their legacy endures not just in what they did, but in what they made possible. A glimpse of a world governed differently, even if only for a moment. Education has embraced this perspective. Universities teach courses on piracy not only in history departments, but in legal studies, cultural theory, and political science. Students learn how pirates challenged the definitions of crime and sovereignty. They examine how narratives around piracy have been used to justify military action, or to critique capitalism, or to question the legitimacy of intellectual property regimes. Piracy has become a field for critical inquiry, a subject that transcends its In museums and classrooms, the pirate story invites uncomfortable questions. Who writes the laws of the sea? Who benefits from their enforcement? Who is remembered and who is erased? These questions do not have simple answers, but in asking them, we honor the complexity of the past. We avoid reducing pirates to mere criminals or glorifying them as misunderstood heroes. We see them instead as human beings, caught in systems beyond their making, navigating as best they could. That navigation, imperfect, improvised, courageous, continues to resonate. In an age of surveillance, enclosure, and algorithmic control, the figure of the pirate remains defiantly analog. He lives by wind and sail, not by code or contract. She disappears into fog rather than into firewalls. The pirate is a reminder that freedom, in its purest form, is often messy, dangerous, and short-lived, but always deeply human. The sea was their theatre, their refuge, their judge. It buried their names and carried their legends. It made them invisible and unforgettable. And though navies sank their ships and lawyers condemned their names, the pirate survives, on maps, in stories, in the restless dreams of those who still wonder what waits beyond the edge of the chart. While the Golden Age of Piracy has long since passed, its shadows linger not only in folklore and pop culture, but also in the institutions and structures built in its wake. The age of wooden ships and cutlasses gave way to steam and steel, to global navies and corporate shipping lines. But the essential questions pirates raised about authority, wealth, and freedom remain unresolved. In this way, piracy continues to haunt the foundations of modern maritime history, not as a ghostly presence, but as an awe. By the early 19th century, many of the mechanisms forged to combat piracy had been absorbed into the broader apparatus of empire. Naval bases sprang up across strategic choke points, Gibraltar, Cape Town, Singapore, offering secure refueling stations and launch points for imperial projection. Merchant shipping was increasingly protected by treaties, convoys, and insurance schemes, reinforcing the idea that the seas were no longer wild, but policed, managed, and owned. This transformation, however, was neither smooth nor total. Smuggling, privateering, and piracy persisted in various forms, especially along the fringes of imperial oversight. In Latin America, newly independent republics inherited vast coastlines but limited naval resources, creating space for rogue mariners to operate under local protection. In the Mediterranean, Barbary corsairs continued their raids into the early 1800s, prompting international coalitions to act against them. The campaign against as the 19th century progressed, piracy became more tightly bound to economic deprivation. No longer the domain of charismatic captains and legendary flotillas, it often emerged in areas beset by famine, war, or imperial neglect. Sailors who turned to piracy in these contexts were less likely to be mythologized than condemned. Their motives, hunger, unemployment, political marginalization, stripped the act of its romance, even as their actions echoed those of their predecessors. The world, it seemed, had yol. Yet the legal structures developed during the height of piracy endured. The principle of universal jurisdiction over pirates remained in place, forming a cornerstone of international maritime law. It allowed states to prosecute pirates regardless of nationality or location. An idea later extended to crimes such as genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The pirate, once a specific figure, had become a legal metaphor for threats to global order. This legal legacy was reinforced by an ever-growing body of maritime treaties and conventions. The 1856 Declaration of Paris, for example, outlawed privateering among signatory states, further closing the gap between sanctioned and unsanctioned violence at sea. The Hague Conventions, the Geneva Conventions, and later United Nations maritime frameworks built on this foundation. Piracy, in many ways, served as the crucible in which the modern law of the sea was forged. Meanwhile, the pirate lived on in other forms. Writers and artists of the Victorian era embraced the romantic pirate as a symbol of rugged independence. Illustrations depicted him with flowing coats, tri-cornered hats, and a knowing grin. More gentleman adventurer than desperate outlaw. This transformation was not accidental. In an age of industrial labor, growing class divides, and colonial bureaucracy, the pirate offered a fantasy of freedom and rebellion. He became a vehicle for critique, cloaked in sea. Children's literature embraced the pirate as well. Stories like Treasure Island and Peter Pan solidified archetypes that continue to shape how young audiences imagine seafaring life. These tales rarely addressed the harsher realities of piracy, its violence, its fleeting victories, its fatal consequences. Instead, they emphasized exploration, treasure hunts, and the triumph of cleverness over authority. These narratives, though sanitized, kept the image of the pirate alive in cultural consciousness. In the 20th century, the advent of film amplified this effect. Hollywood's pirates were swashbucklers, not slavers. Rebels with charm, not outlaws with knives. Errol Flynn, Douglas Fairbanks, and later Johnny Depp embodied a vision of piracy that emphasized flair over fear, spectacle over substance. These portrayals, while entertaining, distanced audiences from the real history of maritime rebellion, reducing complex lives to costume and choreography. At the same time, new scholarship pushed back against this romanticization. Historians began to unearth documents, examine wrecks, and reassess earlier narratives. They highlighted the structural causes of piracy, its relationship to labor exploitation, and its role in shaping global trade networks. They recentered pirates not as anomalies, but as participants, albeit disruptive ones, in a wider story of empire, capitalism, and resistance. This reevaluation opened the door for other voices as well. Researchers began to examine the roles of non-European pirates, of women, of formerly enslaved sailors. They traced how pirate traditions had been adapted in Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Indian Ocean. In doing so, they decentered the Atlantic model of piracy, recognizing it as one chapter in a far broader maritime history. This expansion complicated the image of the pirate, but made it more truthful and more powerful. What emerged was a richer, more diverse understanding of what piracy was and what it meant. No longer a simple story of outlaws versus empires, it became a lens through which to examine migration, labor, violence, and law. It exposed how the sea had long served as both a frontier and a battleground, a place of opportunity and oppression. In the pirates' refusal to play by the rules, scholars found a key to understanding the rules themselves and their limits. As the 21st century unfolds, the figure of the pirate remains relevant. Not only in waters off Somalia or in digital piracy debates, but as a symbol of the global underclass, those excluded from wealth, security, and recognition. Pirates were among the first to globalize rebellion, to act across borders, to defy the monopolies of state and market. In them, we see the precursors of modern resistance, both real and imagined. They remind us that history is not only shaped by institutions, but by those who resist them. That every empire has its dissidents. That beneath every rule lies a choice, whether to obey, to bend, or to break. The pirates of the past made their choice, knowing the risks. Their stories, passed down in court records, shipwrecks, and song, continue to echo across the oceans they once roamed. Today, the resurgence of interest in maritime history has brought new attention to piracy as more than a footnote in naval warfare. Maritime archaeology has uncovered long-buried wrecks, providing material evidence of pirate activity and validating centuries-old accounts with physical proof. Cannonballs, silver coins, surgical tools, and fragments of rigging speak to the daily lives of those who challenged the maritime order. These findings ground the legend in reality, showing not only the tools of pirate codes, once dismissed as myth or propaganda, are now studied as early forms of contractual governance. They demonstrate how marginalized individuals built alternative systems of accountability, even under duress. The codes varied between crews but often contained provisions for the fair distribution of loot, penalties for misconduct, and compensation for injury. Their consistency across time and geography suggests more than coincidence. It hints at a culture of resistance informed by shared values. Furthermore, pirates have become central to conversations about how we remember history. Monuments, reenactments, and tourist attractions often present a sanitized version of piracy, tailored for entertainment and divorced from context. But critical public history initiatives push back against this trend, integrating academic findings into museum exhibits, community projects, and documentary films. The result is a growing awareness that the romantic pirate and the real pirate are not enemies, but differ. This blending of fiction and history has a peculiar power. It reveals how stories can preserve truths too complex or painful to articulate directly. When we imagine the pirate, we are not only invoking a historical actor, we are engaging a symbol that transcends its origins. The pirate becomes a way to think about injustice, autonomy, and risk. These are not merely themes of the past, but enduring elements of human life. Even contemporary geopolitics is not immune to the legacy of piracy. Modern maritime security policies, such as the coordinated naval patrols in the Gulf of Aden, are shaped by centuries of legal precedent originating with anti-piracy campaigns. Military interventions against piracy are justified not only through present danger, but by invoking historical continuity. Yet critics argue that these actions sometimes obscure deeper issues: inequality, failed governance, and economic desperation. The pirate is... At the same time, cultural creators continue to mine the image of the pirate for inspiration. Video games, television series, and fantasy novels reinterpret the pirate for new generations, often layering modern sensibilities onto old archetypes. These reinterpretations are not always historically faithful, but they keep the conversation alive. They allow each era to revisit what piracy meant and what it might mean now. In the end, the enduring fascination with pirates speaks to something elemental. They represent the tension between chaos and control, between the dream of freedom and the need for order. They challenge us to consider what it means to live by one's own rules, and what costs come with that choice. Their world was violent, precarious, and short-lived, but it was also daring, inventive, and defiantly human. As the world sailed into the modern era, the age of traditional piracy gave way to new frontiers of maritime control and global trade. Steam replaced sail, iron replaced wood, and multinational corporations succeeded empires as the dominant forces shaping the seas. Yet even in this transformed environment, the legacy of the pirate endured. not as a relic of lawlessness, but as a symbol of what lies beyond sanctioned systems. Pirates had long inhabited the margins of empire. Now their spirit lingered. The rise of steam-powered vessels in the 19th century fundamentally altered maritime geography. Trade routes became more predictable and sailing schedules more efficient. Harbours were redesigned to accommodate larger ships, and coal depots replaced taverns as the social heart of coastal ports. With predictability came control. The ability of states to monitor and regulate seaborne commerce expanded significantly, and with it, their capacity to suppress unsanctioned actors. The infrastructure of empire. Even so, pockets of resistance remained. Smugglers, mutineers, and rogue traders continued to ply their trade along the lesser-watched coasts of Asia, Africa, and the Americas. In the South China Sea, local networks of maritime resistance challenged colonial tariffs and monopolies. In the Caribbean, contraband continued to flow through secret harbours long after the flags of Spain and England were replaced with those of independent republics. These actors were not pirates in the traditional sense, but by the early 20th century, piracy as once known had become rare, though not extinct. The definition itself had evolved. Legal scholars debated whether political insurgents, rebels at sea, or anti-colonial fighters could be considered pirates under international law. Naval authorities increasingly used the term piracy to delegitimize non-state maritime violence, even when such violence was directed at colonial exploitation. The label, once applied to bandits of opportunity, now served as a tool of This shift was reflected in both law and culture. The League of Nations, and later the United Nations, took up questions of maritime jurisdiction, and piracy was codified within international frameworks. Article 101 of the 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea offered a formal definition. Piracy consisted of illegal acts of violence, detention, or depredation committed for private ends on the high seas. This definition, while clear in theory, left room for interpretation. Where politically, in the mid-20th century, piracy returned to global headlines. Off the coast of China, on the Mekong River, in the waters around Indonesia and the Philippines, maritime attacks surged. These were often carried out by loosely organized bands of armed men in small motorboats, targeting cargo ships, ferries, and even fishing vessels. Governments called them criminals. Local communities sometimes viewed them as survivalists. The world, watching from a distance, revived its fascination with the lawless sea. By the 1990s and early 2000s, a new hotspot emerged off the coast of Somalia. With the collapse of the central government and decades of foreign exploitation of local fisheries, Somali fishermen turned to piracy as both protest and survival. Armed with automatic weapons and GPS devices, they hijacked commercial tankers and demanded multi-million-dollar ransoms. These acts shocked the global shipping industry, which had grown accustomed to the illusion of total control. But to the pirates, the equation way. These modern pirates were not descendants of Blackbeard or Roberts, but their motivations, economic marginalization, lack of state protection, resource theft, echoed older patterns. In many cases, former coastal fishers spoke openly about being pushed into piracy by international vessels trawling their waters illegally. The targets were no longer colonial galleons, but oil tankers and cargo ships flying flags of convenience. The stakes had changed, but the dynamics remained familiar. Power versus precariat. International responses were swift and coordinated. NATO, the European Union, and national navies from China, India, and the United States began joint patrols in the Gulf of Aden. Private security firms proliferated, offering armed protection aboard ships for a price. Maritime law adapted once again, and piracy prosecutions resumed in international courts. But the underlying causes, poverty, political instability, and unequal access to resources, proved harder to address. Suppression was easier than Media coverage shaped the public imagination. Stories of pirates with rocket-propelled grenades, ransom negotiations, and high seas rescues revived interest in the subject, though often devoid of historical context. Few reports explored the roots of the crisis. Even fewer acknowledged the long legacy of maritime resistance stretching back centuries. The modern pirate, like his forebears, became both threat and symbol, a figure who disrupted the smooth flow of global capital and who exposed the fragility. At the same time, the metaphor of the pirate evolved yet again. In the digital realm, the term found new life. File sharing, software cracking, and anti-copyright activism all adopted pirate symbolism. Organizations like the Pirate Bay and the Pirate Party embraced the label, reframing piracy not as theft, but as liberation, from monopoly, censorship, and control. The black flag became binary code. The ship became a server. The canon became code. And yet, the message remained the same. We do not recognize. This digital piracy challenged intellectual property regimes in much the same way that sea piracy had once challenged mercantile monopolies. It raised questions about access, ownership, and the rights of users. Governments responded with legal action and digital surveillance. But the discourse around piracy refused to vanish. It became a proxy for debates over digital rights, information freedom, and cultural power. And it reminded the world that, like the sea, the internet is a space not easily tamed. Through all these transformations, the pirate's image retained its contradictory allure. It represented both threat and freedom, chaos and creativity. As history marched forward, each generation reshaped the legend to suit its anxieties and aspirations. The result is a figure at once timeless and mutable, anchored in historical violence, yet buoyed by imagination. In educational curricula, piracy now appears not just in history classes, but in courses on law, technology, and ethics. Students examine piracy through multiple lenses: legal definitions, political implications, and cultural resonances. They debate whether pirates were heroes or criminals, liberators or opportunists. And in doing so, they engage in a broader exploration of justice, power, and resistance. The pirate becomes a starting point, a prism through which to view complexity. The 21st century world is one of massive flows of goods, data, money, and people. It depends on trust in systems that most people never see: shipping lanes, cloud storage, legal codes, corporate treaties. Pirates, in all their forms, disrupt this trust. They make the invisible visible. They force societies to confront the fragility of their networks. And in doing so, they remind us that order, however carefully constructed, is never absolute. From the high seas to cyberspace, from forgotten islands to crowded courtrooms, the figure of the pirate persists. He evolves, she adapts, they return. Again and again, at the edges of empire and beneath the surface of law, the pirate calls the world to reckon with its own contradictions, and to ask whether another way might yet be possible. Yet for all the fascination, piracy remains deeply uncomfortable. It exposes the failures of law, the violence behind commerce, and the cost of exclusion. Pirates are rarely admirable in practice, but they are undeniably revealing. They thrive in the spaces between control, in the margins left by ambition, in the silence after the cannons fall. They are the question at the heart of empire. What happens when those without power refuse to disappear? This refusal echoes across centuries. It surfaces in uprisings, in art, in protest movements that borrow pirate symbols and metaphors to describe their own resistance. The skull and crossbones no longer signal only danger. They speak of solidarity, subversion, and survival. Pirate radio, pirate books, pirate networks. These terms persist because the logic behind them remains compelling. They reject permission, challenge scarcity, and assert presence in a system built to erase them. Even as governments and corporations attempt to regulate every node of the global network, new forms of piracy emerge: creative, chaotic, unlicensed. Whether copying culture or defying borders, the modern pirate insists on a different kind of ownership. Not legal, but lived. Not purchased, but practiced. This insistence complicates moral judgments. It asks not just what is right or wrong, but who decides and on what terms. As long as there are systems that exclude, there will be those who navigate around them. Pirates may never again rule the seas, but they will continue to haunt the currents of global life, adaptable, resilient, and uninvited. And while the cannons may be gone, their questions remain, echoing in every challenge to the status quo, in every refusal to obey quietly, in every moment where someone chooses the uncertain path over the enforced one. In this way, piracy endures, not as a golden age, but as a stubborn undertow beneath the surface of modernity. It endures in the imagination of those who still believe the world might be charted differently. And in that belief lies its most lasting power. The sea, like the stories told upon it, does not forget, and neither do those who sail beyond its laws. In the quiet hours of early morning, when the sea stretches out like glass and the horizon blurs into mist, it is easy to imagine the silhouette of a ship gliding just out of reach, its sails dark, its flags unfamiliar, its purpose unknown. This image, etched into the imagination of generations, is the inheritance of the age of piracy. It persists because it speaks to something deeper than crime, deeper even than rebellion. It speaks to the enduring human desire to be free from the chains of imposed oath. Across centuries and continents, the pirate has served as a symbol for those who seek another path. In the popular imagination, he is a romantic outlaw, a rogue adventurer, a trickster hero. But beneath the fiction lies a more complicated truth. Pirates were opportunists, fighters, sailors, and survivors. They navigated a world built to exclude them and seized what little they could with force, cunning, and luck. Their legacy is not a blueprint for justice, but a record of resistance, raw, flawed, and, in many ways, the stories we tell about pirates reveal more about us than about them. When we imagine pirates as noble rebels, we affirm our own yearning for autonomy. When we condemn them as criminals, we reaffirm the necessity of order. In both cases, the pirate functions as a projection of fears, hopes, and contradictions. That he can be both celebrated and reviled is testament to the complexity of the historical record and the power of narrative itself. The fascination with pirates also stems from their liminality. They existed between legal categories, between nations, between systems of belonging. They were not quite soldiers, not quite civilians, not quite criminals. They operated in a space that defied easy classification, a space that continues to appeal to those who find themselves constrained by rigid definitions. In the fluidity of pirate identity lies an invitation to reconsider our own assumptions about legitimacy and transgression. Maritime history is, in many respects, the story of boundaries, between land and sea, between empire and independence, between rule and resistance. Pirates navigated those boundaries with intent. They crossed them not just physically, but ideologically. Their refusal to abide by imperial laws challenged the idea that those laws were universal. Their alternative social orders, though often brutal, undermined the pretense that hierarchy was natural or inevitable. Even the tools of their trade, ships, flags, codes, carried symbolic weight. A pirate ship was not just a vessel, but a statement. It declared its independence from sovereign control. Its flag, raised against the wind, was a rejection of imperial iconography. Its code, though unwritten in some cases, established rules that centered shared risk and shared reward. In these ways, pirate life anticipated later debates about governance, consent, and community. These insights have increasingly informed modern scholarship. Historians, anthropologists, and political theorists have all drawn upon piracy to explore themes of statelessness, autonomy, and resistance. Pirate societies, though short-lived, provide case studies in alternative forms of organization. Their legacy challenges the assumption that order must always come from above, and that lawlessness is inherently destructive. In pirate archives, scholars find evidence not of anarchy, but of structure built. Contemporary movements often look to piracy for inspiration. Activist groups, especially those focused on digital rights and anti-authoritarian causes, have adopted pirate iconography to signal dissent. The Pirate Party, founded in Sweden in 2006, is one such example, advocating for transparency, privacy, and free access to information. Though far removed from the plunder of the Caribbean, the use of the term pirate reflects a continuity in spirit, a refusal to accept systems that hoard power and re-sow. In literature and art too, the pirate continues to evolve. New stories reimagine pirates as women, as people of colour, as queer figures, challenging the homogenized narratives of the past. These retellings are not merely revisionist, they are acts of recovery. They restore to the pirate story the diversity it once held, and in doing so, make room for new meanings. The sea, once dominated by imperial navies, becomes a site of multiplicity, imagination, and possibility. But for all the transformations of the pirate myth, the historical pirate remains, anchored in the archives, in court transcripts and naval dispatches, in the bones recovered from sunken wrecks. These sources tell us of real people, of men and women whose lives were shaped by hardship, by rage, by boldness and despair. Their stories are not always easy to hear. They include betrayal, cruelty, and loss. Yet in their totality, they offer a view into a world where choices were limited and courage was off. What then do we make of the pirate today? He is not a hero, though he may be brave. She is not a villain, though she may do harm. They are not role models, but they are not irrelevant. They are reminders that history is not the story of rulers alone. That power is always contested. That within even the most violent moments, there are glimpses of humanity, fierce, flawed, and undeniable. To study piracy is to study contradiction. It is to acknowledge that justice and law are not always aligned. That survival can be resistance. That rebellion can be both necessary and dangerous. It is to see how people carve out meaning in systems not built for them, and how they navigate those systems with whatever tools they can grasp. It is to ask again and again what it means to be free, and what we are willing to risk to be so. This is why piracy matters, not because it offers answers, but because it demands questions. It urges us to look beyond the boundaries drawn by history books and state archives, to consider whose voices have been silenced, whose actions have been criminalized, and whose defiance has been erased. In lifting the veil of legend, we do not diminish the pirate. We restore their complexity, and with it, our own. In the end, perhaps the pirate endures not because he conquered, but because he dared. Because she saw the line and crossed it. Because they believed, however briefly, that another world was possible. That belief, naive, reckless, beautiful, is the tide that carries their memory forward, wave after wave, into the uncharted future. This memory is not preserved only in books and films, but in the very language we speak. Terms like booty, mutiny, marooned, and Jolly Roger have entered common usage, disconnected from their origins, but carrying echoes of that turbulent past. In every idiom and every metaphor that draws from the sea, from navigating rough waters to changing tack, there is a trace of the pirate's influence, subtle and enduring. Even more profoundly, piracy has left its mark on how we imagine freedom. It has become a cipher for self-determination, a symbol of ungoverned space, a challenge to the logic of enclosure. This idea, of freedom not granted but seized, continues to inspire those who live at the edges of systems too vast to control. From political prisoners quoting pirate codes to protesters flying the black flag, the legacy endures not because of nostalgia, but because of need. It is this convergence of history and hope that gives piracy its strange resonance. The pirate was never meant to last. His ship was outgunned, her crew outnumbered, their cause illegal. But for a time, they sailed nonetheless. They found each other, made a world of their own, and dared to call it enough. This act, repeated across decades and oceans, is what transformed piracy from a crime into a story, and from a story into a tradition. In every corner of the globe, seafaring cultures have their pirates. The Bugis of Indonesia, the Corsairs of the Barbary Coast, the Henya women divers of Korea resisting taxation, the river bandits of South America, each with their own codes, legends, and lessons. These stories converge not because they are identical, but because they share a spirit, a willingness to resist what is imposed and to risk everything for what might be possible. And so the study of piracy becomes, in the end, a study of potential, of how people build meaning from rupture, of how law and order are questioned and remade. It is a history full of ambiguity, but also of clarity. The clarity that comes when people face injustice and decide to act, no matter the cost. In this, piracy offers not a destination, but a compass, a direction for inquiry, imagination, and perhaps even action. Long after the last pirate was hanged, long after the last galleon vanished below the waves, the legacy of those who lived beyond the pale of empire remains. It remains in stories whispered in taverns, in footnotes of maritime law, in whispered conversations about sovereignty and control. It remains wherever someone looks out over open water and wonders what lies beyond the line. Because piracy, at its core, was never about the gold. It was about defiance, about choosing peril over submission, wind over chains, salt over silence. And in a world where submission is easy and silence encouraged, that choice deserves remembering, deserves honoring, deserves telling again. To speak of pirates is to speak of danger, yes, but also of courage, of contradiction, of those who looked upon an unjust world and answered not with compliance, but with canvas and cannon, chart and storm. And even when they failed, as most did, they left behind a trace of freedom more enduring than flags or fleets.